business case studies to great effect. In these presentations, he makes his points with subtlety and texture, often using a story-like context instead of abstract statements of theory. He regales his audience with humorous anecdotes and poignant tales rather than with a blizzard of facts and figures. He well knows and wisely exploits the traditional role of the storyteller as a purveyor of complex and detailed information. As a result, his lessons hang together in a coherent latticework of knowledge, available for recall and use when needed. It is clear throughout these talks and speeches that Charlie places a premium on life decisions over investment decisions. His mental models, drawn from every discipline imaginable, recur repeatedly and in no way focus on business portfolio strategy or beta or CAPM. Rather, they center on fundamental truth, human accomplishment, human foibles, and the arduous path to wisdom. Charlie once said, "I wanted to get rich so I could be independent, like Lord John Maynard Keynes." Independence is the end that wealth serves for Charlie, not the other way around. About the book. We open with a portrait biography that chronicles Charlie's progress from a modest Omaha child.
Great beasts of the Stone Age, to man taking his first upright steps.
Welcome, Gilgamesh. For too long,
Oh my god, I had to do it again.
our brave set
Oh, city.
from the seeds of the
Okay.
though small now, our city. We are We are blessed. Such land, our city. If our people, we must, our people's training has come. Our warriors there are those among us. Excellent. Barbarian raid. We cannot.
Okay, I'm not finding this that
Warriors of the blade with
attack.
victory. We should take it. The land surrounding. Excellent. While our build is beyond alone on foot. Already our this our warriors stand before. It would seem friendship, though not. We should. Exploration may. Our scouts await our city. There are no further while our foe, our a wise but let him. Our citizens rejoice. Excellent. With our worry. our scouts continue to push onwards, our builders now these planes possess excellent. But remember, with it,
Oh.
excellent.
Yine ki set it.
Resources and land are not.
Morning. Settings.
Now that our people are fed, let us.
Display settings.
Childhood to prodigious financial success. Next, we summarize the Munger approach to life, learning, decision-making, and investing. This section details both Charlie's unconventional way of thinking and his extraordinary work ethic.
UI upscaling.
Direct the efforts. Excellent.
AI upscaling.
With our quarry now complete. There is still valuable land within our book. Our people truly thrive. We must now. Discipline. Though our policies. We are blessed. Perhaps we are now. The task at hand is of critical importance. The task at hand is of critical importance. task at hand is of. With knowledge comes opportunity. Our
Oh my god, man.
The task at hand is of.
How do you train the settler, man? This is so annoying. This button is so hard.
Eu mei em rimat shautiu em paiter. Ente ki swa en yimiu yem.
What the hell is this?
Our settlers have finished preparations and await your command. However, the lands before them.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. There is an area. Though our settlers are safe under Though
Signy is a 250 square mile tiger trap made up on massive obelisks, riddled with jagged spears, and yes, they will cut your pretty face.
British accent again.
the beauty and majesty of this world is sometimes enough to inspire. Order our people to take root here. Well done. Already this new city. It appears our slingers have completed their... As our army continues to... With our slingers training complete, we may... With writing, we unify our people. A common written language allows our A good city can become a great city through careful planning. Already, the greatest minds in our civilization, but we must not allow these great thinkers to be idle. The task at hand is of critical importance.
Usehotep tu Osiris.
Declare war.
War is upon us. Our people are in danger. We must mobilize an army immediately.
Declaring war, man. Oh my god. I need more of an army.
The task at hand is of critical. The task at hand is. The task at hand is of critical. Our greatest scholars and scientists. Our people have prospered under your guidance. The task before us is great, but under your leadership,
As it turns out, Mount Kilimanjaro is...
The task at hand is... The task at hand is of... The task at hand is of... We have the opportunity to develop a formal trade route between two cities.
The twin plots of his amazing success. In the balance of the book, Charlie speaks to his audience via speeches and talks he gave over a 20-year period. In the expanded third edition of the book, we added a new talk Charlie delivered at the USC Gould School of Law commencement on May 13, 2007. So the original 10 talks have grown to become a not-so-round 11 talks. These speeches and addresses cover a wide spectrum of Charlie's interests, ranging from how one acquires worldly wisdom, to how his multiple mental models can be applied to business, to how the investment strategies used by charitable foundations can be improved. The 11th talk is a special rendition of The Psychology of Human Misjudgment that Charlie created especially for this book. Each talk is well worth your time, not only for the enjoyment it will provide you, but also for what you can absorb from the rich assortment of ideas and practices that Charlie relies on. You will probably never find a better opportunity to learn from someone so smart and so forthright. In his talks, Charlie simply opens up and tells it like it is. A special note, Charlie's redundancy in expressions and examples is purposeful. For the kind of deep fluency he advocates, he knows that repetition is the heart of instruction.
There's so many
A word about the
buttons.
style and layout of the book. Charlie is enormously curious about nearly everything he bumps into in life. Accordingly, as we ourselves bumped into people, places, and subjects mentioned by Charlie in his talks, we supplemented his text with related information. The endnotes peppered throughout the talks, not included in the audio edition, serve to explain concepts, add a supporting voice, or emphasize an important Munger idea. We hope these will not only inform, but also amuse and even encourage you to further pursue these subjects on your own.
Not really that
I wish you good reading and an appreciation of the brightness and dry humor that those of us who know Charlie Munger have come to treasure and expect from him. Chapter 1. A Portrait of Charles T. Munger. Behind the extraordinary story of Berkshire Hathaway are two financial geniuses, the widely acclaimed Warren Buffett and his silent partner, Charlie Munger, who relishes his obscurity. Charlie is Warren's friend, lawyer, advisor, devil's advocate. Warren once called him the abominable no-man, and one of the largest stockholders in one of the most successful publicly traded companies in American business history. Since 1964, when Warren, and some years later Charlie, assumed management of Berkshire, its market value has increased an astonishing 13,500 times, from $10 million to roughly $135 billion, without much of an increase in outstanding shares. Such phenomenal growth is the singular achievement of these two unassuming Midwesterners, who combined their synergistic abilities to recognize and seize opportunities other businessmen consistently overlook. While Warren is one of the most admired and publicized business leaders in the country, Charlie has purposefully sidestepped the limelight, choosing relative anonymity instead. To better understand this complex and highly private businessman, we must start at the beginning. Charles Thomas Munger was born on January 1st, 1924, in America's heartland, Omaha, Nebraska. Many notables share his Midwestern roots: Will Rogers, Henry Fonda, John Pershing, Harry Truman, Walt Disney, Ann Landers, Gerald Ford, and of course Warren Buffett. Charlie initially crossed paths with the Buffett family during the formative years of his life when he worked at Buffett & Son, an upscale grocery store in Omaha, about 6 blocks from the Munger household. The boss and part owner was Warren's grandfather, Ernest. A strict disciplinarian, he scheduled his young workers for 12-hour shifts with no meals or breaks. According to Charlie, his boss's staunch anti-socialist attitude was manifested in his rule requiring the boys to present 2 pennies at the end of their shifts to cover their share of the cost of the new Social Security Act. In return, they received a $2 daily wage, along with a considerable lecture about the evils of social conditions in the Buffett grocery store, had a lasting influence on both Charlie and Warren. Warren, 6 years younger, served his hard times under Grandpa Ernest several years after his future business partner had moved on. Charlie's formal education began at Dundee Elementary School, where he and his younger sisters, Mary and Carol, were indoctrinated with ethical homilies. Charlie's teachers remember a smart kid who was also inclined to be a bit of a wiseacre. He enjoyed challenging the conventional wisdom of teachers and fellow students with his ever-increasing knowledge gained through voracious reading, particularly biographies. Today, he can't remember the first time he was exposed to the aphorisms of Ben Franklin, but they fueled an ineffaceable admiration for the eclectic and eccentric statesman and inventor. Charlie's parents, Al and Florence Munger, encouraged reading and gave each of their children several books at Christmas, usually devoured by that night. At the nearby home of the Mungers' close friends, the Davises, Charlie often read the medical journals belonging to Dr. Ed Davis, who was both his father's best friend and a family physician. Charlie's early exposure to Dr. Davis's medical library spawned a lifelong interest in science. By the time he was 14, the precocious learner had also become one of the doctor's best friends. Charlie became so interested in medicine that he watched motion pictures of Dr. Davis, a urologist, performing surgery, and became fascinated with the statistical outcomes of similar procedures in the field. At home, Charlie developed a fondness for raising hamsters and periodically traded them with other children. Even at an early age, Charlie showed a sagacious negotiating ability and usually gained a bigger specimen or one with unusual coloring. When his brood grew to 35 animals, his mother ordered an end to his hobby because of the pungent odor from his basement hamster farm. One of his sisters remembered years later that the family had to endure the incessant squeaking of hungry hamsters until Charlie arrived home from school to feed them. Charlie attended Central High School, a very large public school that was recognized as a good college preparatory school. The teachers, mostly women, were dedicated to their work and to their students. The Central High curriculum provided a conventional classic education, in which Charlie naturally excelled because of his logically driven, inquiring mind. Throughout elementary and secondary school, Charlie was younger and smaller than his classmates, having been moved ahead in elementary school after his mother taught him to read phonically. Too small to compete in regular high school sports, he joined the rifle team, earned a varsity letter, and eventually became team captain. His letterman's sweater, a large letter on a very small chest is Charlie's memory, attracted attention from co-eds who wondered how such a scrawny kid could earn a varsity letter. Fortunately for Charlie, his father was an avid outdoorsman and duck hunter and took joy in his son's marksmanship. Omaha in the 1920s was the proverbial melting pot. Different races and religions mixed socially and commercially, and crime was practically unknown. Doors and vehicles were left unlocked, and a person's word was trusted implicitly. Kids played kick the can on warm summer evenings and went to Saturday matinees to see the latest talkies, such as King Kong, a favorite of 8-year-old Charlie. The 1930s brought hard times, and Omaha experienced the severity of the Great Depression. Charlie's observations of the plight of those less fortunate made a lasting impression. He saw hobos roaming the streets looking for handouts, and others who were willing to sweep a driveway or porch in exchange for a sandwich. Thanks to family connections, Charlie landed a boring job counting passers-by. It paid 40 cents an hour. Charlie preferred this work to carrying heavy boxes of groceries. Charlie's grandfather was a respected federal judge, and his father followed in his footsteps to become a prosperous lawyer. Charlie's immediate family was not dramatically affected by the Depression, but some members of Charlie's extended family were. This era provided real learning experiences for young Charlie. He witnessed the generosity and business acumen of his grandfather as he helped rescue a small bank in Stromsburg, Nebraska, that was owned by Charlie's uncle Tom. Because of the miserable economy and drought-damaged crops, the bank's farm-based clients were defaulting on loans. Tom had rolled up $35,000 in uncollectible notes when he called upon Grandpa Munger for support. The judge risked nearly half of his assets by exchanging $35,000 in sound first mortgages for the bank's weak loans, thus enabling Tom to open his doors after Roosevelt's bank holiday. The judge eventually recovered most of his investment, but not until a great many years later. Judge Munger also sent his daughter's husband, a musician, to pharmacy school and helped him buy a well-located pharmacy that had closed because of the Depression. The business prospered and secured the future for Charlie's aunt. Charlie learned that by supporting each other, the Mungers weathered the worst economic collapse in the nation's history. Fortunately, Al Munger's law practice prospered during the Depression and was given a boost when the United States Supreme Court agreed to review a tax case involving a small soap-making company he represented. Coincidentally, the huge Colgate-Palmolive company was also affected by the court's decision. Concerned that the Midwestern attorney didn't have the requisite experience to argue successfully before the highest court, Colgate offered to pay Al liberally to step aside and allow a famous New York attorney to take his place. The big city lawyer lost the case, while Al pocketed a substantial fee. Later, Al joked that he could have lost the case just as well for a much smaller fee. The amount of the fee has never been revealed, but it was enough, when combined with income Al earned from his other clients, to help keep the Mungers comfortable during the Depression. Charlie also helped the family by working to earn his own spending money and thus learned firsthand the value of financial independence. In 1941, as the war raged across the Atlantic, Charlie graduated from Central High School and left Omaha for the University of Michigan. There he chose mathematics as his major, drawn by the appeal of numerical logic and reason. He also discovered physics after enrolling in a basic course to fulfill an academic requirement for science. Charlie was fascinated by the power of physics and its boundless reach. In particular, he was impressed by the process followed by physicists such as Albert Einstein to address the unknown. Physics-like problem-solving was to become a passion for Charlie, and is a skill he considers helpful in framing the problems of life. He has often stated that anyone who wants to be successful should study physics because its concepts and formulas so beautifully demonstrate the powers of sound theory. College-aged men were then in high demand for military service. Days after turning 19 and completing his second year at Michigan, Charlie enlisted in the Army Air Corps in a program that would eventually make him a second lieutenant. He was sent to the Albuquerque campus of the University of New Mexico for studies in general science and engineering. Next, he was shuffled to the prestigious California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California. He was schooled in thermodynamics and the science of meteorology, then essential to flyers, and trained to become a meteorologist. After completing his studies at Caltech, Charlie was dispatched to a permanent duty station in Nome, Alaska. While still in the service, he married Nancy Huggins, a young woman from Pasadena who was a good friend of his sister Mary at Scripps College. They were stationed in Albuquerque and then San Antonio until Charlie was discharged from the Army Air Corps in 1946. Soon, Charlie and Nancy had their first child, a boy whom they named Teddy. Although he had attended several universities, Charlie still did not have a bachelor's degree. Nevertheless, using the GI Bill, he applied to Harvard Law School, where his father had preceded him. His lack of an undergraduate degree threatened to derail him, but a family friend, former Harvard Law School Dean Roscoe Pound, interceded on Charlie's behalf. Charlie was admitted, despite the determination of the admissions office to first send him back to college. As it turned out, Charlie had little trouble succeeding at Harvard, though he annoyed a few people along the way. Because of his intellect, the Army measured his IQ at the top of the curve, Charlie had a tendency to be abrupt, which was often interpreted as rudeness. Actually, Charlie was just in a hurry, and the customary pleasantries of the classroom were of little concern to him. Even so, he was liked by most of his peers and fully enjoyed the social aspects of student life in Cambridge. Charlie graduated from Harvard Law School in 1948 and was one of 12 in his class of 335 to graduate magna cum laude. He considered joining his father's law practice, but after a discussion with his father, both of them concluded that Charlie should try a larger city. He headed off to Southern California, a place he had liked while a student at Caltech. After passing the California bar exam, he joined the firm of Wright and Garrett, later renamed Music, Peeler and Garrett. Charlie built a house designed by his architect uncle, Frederick Stott, in South Pasadena, where he and Nancy and their 3 children, Teddy, Molly, and Wendy, lived. Despite outward appearances, all was not sunny in Charlie's world. His marriage was in trouble, and he and his wife finally divorced in 1953. Not long thereafter, Charlie learned that his adored son Teddy was terminally ill with leukemia. It was a significant burden for 29-year-old Charlie. In that era, before bone marrow transplants, there was no hope. A friend remembers that Charlie would visit his dying son in the hospital and then walk the streets of Pasadena crying. During this sad time, his friend and law partner, Roy Tolles, arranged through a friend for Charlie to meet Nancy Barry Borthwick, who lived in Los Angeles. She was a Stanford graduate and had 2 small boys close to the ages of his girls. Charlie and Nancy had much in common and had fun together, and after a few months of dating, became engaged. They were married in a small family wedding in January 1956, and all 4 children, his girls and her boys, aged 4 to 7, attended the wedding. Charlie and Nancy lived in her house in the hills of West Los Angeles for several years. Then, partly to shorten Charlie's daily commute, they moved to Hancock Park, where they still reside. The house they built there was large enough for their ever-expanding family, 3 more boys and a girl for a total of 8. Fortunately, both liked children. They also liked golf, the beach, and social clubs. Charlie and Nancy were soon members of the University Club, the California Club, the Los Angeles Country Club, and the Beach Club. With many new responsibilities, Charlie worked hard at his law practice. Even so, his earnings were unsatisfactory to him as they were based on a combination of billable hours and seniority. He wanted more than what a senior law partner would be able to earn. He sought to be like his firm's leading capitalist clients, in particular the universally admired Harvey Mudd, later the founder of the college bearing his name. With Nancy's support, he turned to outside ventures and alternative ways to generate income. However, he never forgot the sound principles taught by his grandfather, to concentrate on the task immediately in front of him and to control spending. Following this conservative approach, Charlie seized opportunities to build wealth. He began investing in stocks and acquired equity in one of his clients' electronics businesses, a practice common among lawyers in the mid-1950s and 1960s. This investment was mutually beneficial. Charlie gained invaluable knowledge about business, while his client enjoyed the proactive attention of a lawyer who knew more than just the law. In 1961, Charlie tackled property development for the first time in partnership with Otis Booth, a client and friend. The venture, building condominiums on land near Caltech, was a smashing success, and the partners earned a handsome profit of $300,000 on a $100,000 investment. Charlie and Otis then undertook other successful construction and development projects in Pasadena. Later, Charlie participated in similar projects in Alhambra, California. He sharpened his business acumen by handling the negotiations and contracts. In all cases, he left all of his profits in real estate ventures so that bigger and bigger projects became possible. When he stopped in 1964, he had a nest egg of $1.4 million from real estate projects alone. In February 1962, he joined 4 colleagues from Music, Peeler, and Garrett in establishing a new law firm. The original partners were Roy Coles, Rod Hills, Dick Esbenshade, Fred Warder, and Charlie. They were joined by Rod's wife Carla and James T. Wood, a sole practitioner and friend of the Hills. They named the firm Munger, Tolles & Hills. Over the years, the firm had several names, always beginning with Munger Tolles. With the addition of Ron Olson, it finally became Munger, Tolles & Olson, shortened as Munger Tolles or MTO. The successful practice of law was by then a backstop rather than an ending objective for Charlie. But about the time that he was launching his new law firm, he was carefully crafting his exit plan. Charlie set up an investment partnership with Jack Wheeler, and they were later joined by Al Marshall. The idea for this partnership arose a few years earlier when the death of Charlie's father required him to return to Omaha to administer the estate. To welcome him home, the children of Charlie's friend and medical mentor, Dr. Ed Davis, arranged for a dinner party. Both of the Davis boys, Eddie Jr. and Neil, were former childhood chums of Charlie and were now physicians, while their sister Willa had married an Omaha businessman, Lee Seaman. The dinner party included Willa and Lee, Neil and his wife Joan, and a fellow named Warren Buffett. Charlie recognized Warren's family name from his days at Buffett & Son, and Warren had heard of Charlie a few years earlier when he was raising investment capital in Omaha. At one point, Warren had met with Dr. Davis and his wife Dorothy to explain his investment philosophy, and they agreed to place a large part of their life savings, $100,000, with him. Why? The doctor explained that Warren reminded him of Charlie Munger. Warren didn't know Charlie, but already had at least one good reason to like him. During the homecoming dinner, Charlie and Warren realized they shared many ideas. It also became evident to the others at the table that this was going to be a two-way conversation. As the evening progressed, the two young men, Warren was 29 and Charlie 35, became engrossed in a wide-ranging dialogue covering many aspects of business, finance, and history. Where one was knowledgeable, the other was just as excited to learn. Warren was unenthusiastic about Charlie's continued practice of law. He said that while law might be a good hobby for Charlie, it was a far less promising business than what Warren was doing. Warren's logic helped Charlie to decide to quit law practice at the earliest point he could afford to do so. When Charlie returned to Los Angeles, the conversations continued via telephone and lengthy letters, sometimes as long as 9 pages. It was evident to both that they were meant to be in business together. There was no formal partnership or contractual relationship. The bond was created by a handshake and backed by 2 Midwesterners who understood and respected the value of one's word. There were many benefits to their partnership: friendship, investment opportunities, and the unique ability to grasp each other's ideas and observations. Later, the 2 organizations they headed were also beneficiaries. As Warren was investing in and acquiring companies, he sent business to Munger Tolles, a practice that allowed him over time to benefit from having one of the nation's top law firms at his disposal. Munger Tolles, meanwhile, not only got Buffett's legal fees, but also gained because his reputation attracted other blue-chip clients to the firm. Munger Tolles is not just about money, though. Mirroring the way Charlie conducts his personal life, the firm has an enviable record of quietly providing pro bono assistance to support groups for impoverished and disadvantaged people in the Los Angeles community. To this day, Charlie continues to influence the firm's attorneys, reminding them, you don't need to take the last dollar, and choose clients as you would friends. Though Charlie left the firm as an active partner in 1965 after only 3 years, his indelible influence remains, as indicated by the fact that his name still heads the listing of 175 attorneys. When he left, he didn't take his share of the firm's capital. Instead, he directed that his share go to the estate of his young partner, Fred Warder, who left behind a wife and children when he died of cancer. Charlie's plan for financial independence was soon working with great success. He spent much time building the asset base of Wheeler Munger & Company, his investment partnership with Jack Wheeler. He also spent time working in various real estate developments. All was going as planned, with no significant reverses. At Wheeler Munger & Company, Charlie was investing in stocks, partly with his own money and partly with other people's money. Charlie concentrated more on putting his capital to work than attracting new clients. Because Jack Wheeler held 2 seats on the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange, the partnership paid low trading commissions, while Wheeler Munger kept the overhead cost at close to zero. As time passed, Charlie and Warren kept up their frequent telephone conversations and letters, sharing ideas and investment concepts. Sometimes they would agree to invest in the same company, other times they went in different directions. In time, their independent portfolios had overlapping investments. Warren invested in the blue chip stamp company and became the largest single shareholder. Charlie became the second largest shareholder, and eventually Berkshire Hathaway ended up acquiring the company. Charlie built the Wheeler-Munger Partnership from 1962 through 1975. It did exceptionally well for the first 11 years, compounding at 28.3% gross, 20% net, versus 6.7% for the Dow, without a single down year. But the partnership was hit hard in the vicious bear market of 1973 and 1974, when it fell 31.9% and 31.5% in back-to-back years, as the partnership's largest holdings, Blue Chip Stamps and New America Fund, fell sharply. This decline was, despite, as Charlie puts it, having its major investments virtually sure of eventually being saleable at prices higher than the quoted market prices. But the partnership rebounded strongly in 1975, rising 73.2%, bringing the overall record over 14 years to 19.8%, 13.7% net compounded annual returns versus 5% for the Dow. After this difficult experience, Charlie followed Warren in concluding that he no longer wanted to manage funds directly for investors. Warren had closed his own partnerships in 1969. Instead, they resolved to build equity through stock ownership in a holding company. When Wheeler-Munger was liquidated, its stakeholders received shares in Blue Chip Stamps and Diversified Retailing. Later, these shares were converted into Berkshire Hathaway stock, which ended 1975 at $38. Today, each share is worth more than $85,000, making Charlie a member of the Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest individuals. While he doesn't mind the wealth, he regrets having his name on any such list. Despite his healthy self-image, Charlie would prefer to be anonymous. The story of Berkshire Hathaway's extraordinary success under Warren and Charlie's leadership has been told many times elsewhere, so the details won't be repeated here. To summarize, however, they have a spectacular track record of identifying undervalued companies and then either buying large stakes in the public markets or acquiring them outright. Regarding the latter, they have acquired a diverse assortment of businesses such as Johns Manville, the Buffalo Evening News, Flight Safety International, NetJets, Shaw Carpet, Benjamin Moore, Geico, and Dairy Queen. In addition, they have purchased meaningful stakes in public companies such as the Washington Post, Coca-Cola, Gillette, and American Express. For the most part, they have held their major investments for the long term. In fact, they still own almost every business they've ever acquired outright. Charlie's affinity for Benjamin Franklin's expansive career in government, business, finance, and industry can be found in his many speeches and whenever he holds an audience, large or small. At the 75th anniversary of See's Candies, Charlie said, "I am a biography nut myself, and I think when you are trying to teach the great concepts that work, it helps to tie them into the lives and personalities of the people who develop them. I think you learn economics better if you make Adam Smith your friend. That sounds funny, making friends among the eminent dead, but if you go through life making friends with the eminent dead who had the right ideas, I think it will work better for you in life and work better in education. It's way better than just giving the basic concepts." Franklin used his self-made wealth to achieve financial independence so he could concentrate on societal improvement. Charlie admires that trait in his mentor and strives to emulate Franklin. He has had a long involvement with Good Samaritan Hospital and Harvard Westlake School, both in Los Angeles, and has chaired the boards of each. He and Nancy have also long supported Stanford University and the Huntington Library, art collections, and botanical gardens in San Marino, California. They provided funding for a major expansion to the Huntington called the Munger Research Center. Although Charlie is a self-described conservative Republican, chief among his causes is Planned Parenthood. He believes that every child deserves to be born to a welcoming mother. He also supports efforts to improve the environment and the quality of education. As the father of 8 and grandfather of 16, Charlie regards his legacy as helping future generations inherit a better world. Chapter 2. Remembering. The Children on Charlie. From Charles T. Munger, Jr. On the last day of a family ski vacation in Sun Valley when I was 15 or so, my dad and I were driving back in the snow when he took a 10-minute detour to gas the red Jeep we were driving. He was pressed for time to have our family catch the plane home, so I was surprised to notice as he pulled into the station that the tank was still half full. I asked my dad why we had stopped when we had plenty of gas, and he admonished me, "Charlie, when you borrow a man's car, you always return it with a full tank of gas." My freshman year at Stanford, an acquaintance lent me his car, more because friends we had in common twisted his arm than because he knew me all that well. The tank was half full and the Audi Fox was red. So I remembered the Jeep and topped up the tank before I brought the car back. He noticed. We've had a lot of good times since, and he stood as a groomsman at my wedding. After Stanford, I learned that on that vacation we had been staying at Rick Guerin's house and driving Rick Guerin's Jeep. Rick is one of my dad's friends who, on his return to Sun Valley, certainly wouldn't have been troubled and was unlikely even to notice if his Jeep had had less gas than when he left it. My dad still didn't skip a point of fairness and consideration. So I was taught that day not only how to get a good friend, but also how to keep one. From Wendy Munger. My dad often used the forum of the family dinner table to try to educate his children. His favorite educational tools were the morality tale, in which someone faced an ethical problem and chose the correct path, and the downward spiral tale, in which someone made the wrong choice and suffered an inevitable series of catastrophic personal and professional losses. His specialty was the downward spiral tale. He could really warm to the topic of apocalyptic consequences. He used such extreme and horrific examples that we were often simultaneously groaning and laughing by the time he finished. He's in a league of his own when it comes to describing negative outcomes and the lessons to be learned from them. His morality tales were more straightforward. I remember the story my dad told his kids, then ranging from age 5 to 25, about a financial officer at one of his companies who made a mistake that resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the company. As soon as this officer realized his mistake, he went to the president of the company and told him about it. My dad told us that the president then said, "This was a terrible mistake, and we don't want you ever to make another one like it, but people make mistakes, and we can forgive that. You did the right thing, which was to admit your mistake. If you had tried to hide the mistake or cover it up for even a short time, you would be out of this company. As it is, we'd like you to stay." I think back on this story every time I hear of yet another government official who chose the cover-up instead of the honest confession after making a mistake. I don't know why I use the past tense in describing my dad's educational efforts at the dinner table. His oldest children are heading toward their 60s, the table is now crowded with grandchildren, and he's still using his distinctive style of storytelling to keep us on the side of the angels. We're very lucky to have him at the head of our table. From William H. Hal Borthwick. It has been a fascinating and wonderful 50 years, nearly, since Charlie and my mother were married. There were many opportunities that I offered Charlie for formative education. Here are a couple. Do the job right the first time. This story goes back to Minnesota times. One of my jobs as a driving-age teen was to pick up and deliver the housekeeper from the town of Cass Lake. This wasn't just a drive down the street. The boat had to be driven across the lake to the marina, where I would hop into the car to drive to town, and then the process was reversed. Part of my job in the morning was to pick up a newspaper while I was in town. Well, one day a big storm blew in. Rain, waves, wind, etc. Big time. With all the excitement and difficulty, I did get to town in the morning and returned with the maid, but I forgot the paper. Charlie and I had a 1 second or so discussion after I answered the question, "Where's my paper?" in the negative. Go back and get the paper and never forget it again. So back I went through the storm to get the paper, bouncing in the waves with rain sheeting off the boat, thinking to myself that I wasn't going to allow anything like this ever to happen again. Be responsible. Charlie's mother drove herself from Omaha to Minnesota each summer. When she was there, we used her car for errands. There was but one set of keys, and while I was playing with friends in a sailing boat on the lake, the keys fell out of my pocket into 5 feet of murky water. I went home and confessed. Of course, in the Great North Woods, there aren't many locksmiths, and with Charlie, there wasn't patience for such stupidity. The solution, again in about a second, was, go out with your friends and keep diving till you get those keys and don't come home without them. After about 2 hours of diving, with the sun sinking like a stone, the miraculous glint of metal in the weeds was before my eyes, and I could go home. There are a lot of these gems from Minnesota because in those days when Charlie worked so hard and so long, that was the only meaningful time we spent with him. During the work weeks, he was off before dawn and home about dinner time, and then studied Standard & Poor's, and later would spend a couple of hours on the phone with Warren. From David Borthwick. Many years ago, Father decided our Minnesota lake cabin absolutely had to have a tennis ball practice machine for the court that had been built a few years earlier. While he certainly wanted the children to groove their ground strokes, there was a bit more to it than that. For it was Father who was out on the court more than anyone, with the machine positioned so he could endlessly practice volley close by the net. Before long, he mastered the well-placed, easy put-away volleys, the kinds of shots everyone else instinctively tried to kill but usually hit into the net or 10 feet out. By working on the tennis version of golf's short game, which few others could be bothered to practice, Father, as he's done throughout his life, gave himself a fair if maddening competitive advantage. I really dreaded playing against him, especially in doubles, where the net play really counts. Thank God it was tennis, not business. Thinking about Father made me remember a long-ago humorous TV beer ad in which a smartly dressed man at a table is so engrossed in his glass of beer as to be oblivious to a rampaging bull charging a bullfighter right in front of him. He doesn't flinch even when the bull smashes the table into matchsticks. The announcer's tagline was, "Try this beer for a truly unique experience," or something like that. Take away the beer and substitute the financial market listings, architectural plans, or a scholarly biography of Keynes, and you have a dead-on comedic take on Father, night after night in his favorite chair, poring over something, all but deaf to the roughhousing younger children, blaring TV, and Mom trying to summon him to dinner. Even when not reading, Father was often so deep in contemplation that a routine drive to take Molly and Wendy back to Pasadena could have turned into an excursion to San Bernardino without Mom calling out the correct freeway turnoffs. Whatever was on his mind, it wasn't the outcome of a football game or a botched golf shot. Father's ability to Chinese wall off the most intrusive distractions from whatever mental task he was engaged in, a practice alternately amusing and irritating if you were trying to get his attention, accounts as much as anything else for his success. From Molly Munger. When I went to college in 1966, I was very lucky to have been thoroughly steeped in Daddy's influence. In an angry and radical era, I would buy the Wall Street Journal or Fortune at the subway kiosk just outside the college gates, tuck it under my Oxford cloth arm, and stride off to economics and business classes. People were occupying the dean's office, going to jail. I was in the basement of the Lamont Library learning how to read a balance sheet. Daddy raised us to be skeptical, even contrarian, and that was a particularly helpful way of thinking to carry into the maelstrom of the late 60s. Over many years, sitting in the library at our house on June Street, he had told us often funny stories of people who either followed the group too blindly or lashed out too reflexively. Crazy, maladjusted, pompous, self-satisfied. We knew from his adjectives what he thought we should avoid. In Minnesota, he found a way to hardwire the same message into our very bodies. He had arranged for the old Larson Boat Works to make us an aquaplane, a heavy wooden affair we stood on as he towed it behind the boat. He would make sharp turns to see if we could hold on, and the only way to avoid the disgrace of a fall was to keep shifting our weight to compensate for the extreme angles. Then, and on into the future, I would always be viscerally terrified if it seemed any thought or activity was getting out of hand in one direction or another. When I was in college, Daddy had 7 other children to raise, worked in a seedy part of Spring Street, and owned but one company, a small grimy outfit that made motor additive. But he saw these were unhinged times. He sent me the allowance of a much richer father, keeping me in professionally ironed shirts and making me feel sharp as a bandbox. From 3,000 miles away, he continued to help me keep my balance. I could go on. Suffice it to say that our father has always known what he was doing, as a parent as in so much else. I appreciated it greatly. I still do. From Emily Ogden. "You have your father's hands," my husband remarked out of the blue as we shared a glass of wine. I looked at him, a little stunned, not by the comparison, but by his telepathy. I'd been devising a short piece about my father, and the very subject had been on my mind. I had already noticed that my oldest son's hands are like his grandfather's, with fingertips slightly squared and nail beds shaped like teacups rather than ovals. But it's something about the way our hands take positions that first sparks the comparison. My father, my son, and I all cross our hands behind us in the same distinct manner, the left hand holding the wrist of the right as we walk, mine's elsewhere. "What is it about my hands exactly that reminds you of my father's?" I asked. "It's in the U, where your index finger curves into your thumb," he said, showing me. "It's the way you hold things there." My father is holding his hands out above me. His fingers are curled and his thumbs are pointing at each other, like handles on a bike. I reach my girl arms up straight and I grasp each of his thumbs as he lifts me off the ground. I hang on, delighted, until my strength is spent, and when one child is too big for thumbs, there is always another down through the line of grandchildren. Sometimes we'd get him to put down the Wall Street Journal and play sandwich. As he sits in the green armchair in the library, we pile on like the bacon, lettuce, and tomato of a BLT, his hands squeezing us together in a multi-layered hug. My father holds a perfect chicken egg. We've won the father-daughter egg toss, earning me one of my favorite possessions, a marble cube sprouting gilt acanthus leaves with a life-size golden replica of an egg on top. This trophy sits on my desk, reminding me of the sunny day when my dad was so present and so gentle as to keep a flying egg from breaking in either of our hands. My father's hands knew the tensile strength of different fishing lines by feel. They tie on a chartreuse jig or a plain old hook. His hands rise to his lips, where he cinches his knots with his teeth and bites off the extra line. His hands get wet reaching into tin bait buckets. They pinch twisting black leeches, or one of Leroy's famous minnows, guaranteed to catch fish or die trying. His hands hold yellow-green zingers, pickles so spicy hot, a bite will bring a laugh, and peanut butter mustard sandwiches. My father's hands rise early with the rest of him and appear at the edges of the business pages. In Minnesota, he might crumple this newsprint into loose balls, build kindling pyramids, strike long hearth matches, and press spade-shaped wooden bellows. With the fire lit, he might cook blueberry buckwheat pancakes on the Ben Franklin wood stove, using an old wood-handled spatula with chipped red paint. But if you play password and give the clue Charlie Munger's hands, anyone will first answer books. No matter where he is, his hands are always holding open a volume, typically a Ben Franklin biography or the latest treatise on genetics. One might also answer graph paper for the buildings he's been designing. When I think of my father's hands, I also see them up on stage, in front of thousands in Omaha every year. His fingers encircle a Diet Coke, pinch peanut brittle or the stick of a dilly bar, or try to search incognito through a See's Candies box, zeroing in on the rum nougat. His hands are crossed in front of him as he shakes his head, saying, "I have nothing to add," or they move to the rhythm of a longer philosophical answer, making all the hands in the stadium clap together. My father's hands, gesturing alongside every colorful joke and guiding story, have molded me as surely as a sculptor's. I can be nothing but glad and grateful for the touch of my father's hands in mine, and in my son's. From Barry Munger. Several years ago, I came across a book by Calvin Trillin called Messages from My Father, a memoir about Trillin's father, Abe, who was born in Ukraine, grew up in Missouri, and spent much of his career operating neighborhood grocery stores in Kansas City. Abe Trillin regarded thrift as a moral virtue, paid his bills the day they arrived, and got up at 4 a.m, 6 days a week to pick the produce for his stores. A man of few words, he was nevertheless convivial, trenchantly funny, and spoke naturally to small children. He was skilled at cards. He was sardonic, but had an underlying optimism that one could get along in the world with the proper outlook and character. The fact that my father shares many of these qualities, even if he's not known for his discernment about produce, does not fully explain my attachment to this light, deft, and anecdotal little book. Reading it somehow conjures my father for me, even though in the broad outlines of his life my father has almost nothing in common with Abe Trillin, other than the fact that my father once worked part-time at a Midwestern grocery store, Buffett & Son in Omaha. Like my father, Abe Trillin had a fundamental reserve, partially Midwestern in origin, that was at odds with his personable qualities. He did not regard a long drive in a car or a fishing outing as an opportunity to catch up. He did not linger on the telephone. His son eventually came to marvel at how much my father managed to get across to me without those heart-to-hearts that I've read about fathers and sons having in the study, or in the rowboat, or in the car. The title Messages from My Father comes from the author's surmise that his father must have been communicating his expectations through coded messages. It's possible that my father had a code so subtle that I didn't know of its existence, he writes. Anyone who knows my father knows that his manner of expression is not always subtle, but he has many ways of sending his messages. If he doesn't like the way his bridge partner plays out a hand, for example, he might say, "You played that like a plumber." But if he wants to offer serious counsel to one of his children, he is more likely to couch the message in an anecdote, preferably delivered in a group setting so that no one is singled out. In both instances, he appears blunt and avuncular, that inimitable Charlie, but at the card table he uses a lack of indirection for harmless ribbing, and at the dinner table he uses indirection to spare feelings. He's more subtle than he appears. A friend of mine recently began an anecdote about my father by saying, "So your dad's sitting in his chair like Rushmore?" I knew exactly what he meant. Not many people can summon up the image of a 5,700-foot granite mountain and the faces of 4 presidents simply by taking possession of an upholstered chair, but my father can. All of the Munger children have at one time or another approached Rushmore to make a request and felt like Dorothy approaching Oz, except that Oz was more voluble. Rushmore did not always respond. Sometimes my father made a low, steady noise from somewhere around his larynx as though Rushmore had gone volcanic, but that was not so easy to interpret. Can you be more subtle than silent? Unlike Abe Trillin, perhaps, my father really does send messages in the form of speeches he has written, letters he has received and sent, and articles from various sources about social policy, psychology, business ethics, and law, among other topics. Many of them appear in this book. What doesn't appear is the note my father scrawled on the enclosure. The note is usually extremely brief and often just a send-to list, but every once in a while the note will have a wry fillip, like this one from 1996, which was appended to a long, appreciative letter from a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder in Sweden. "I hope you find this amusing," my father wrote. "If only I had the influence with my wife and children that I have in some other quarters." When I finished the Trillin book, I sent it to my father. Even if he didn't recognize himself in it, I figured he would enjoy the book's Midwestern milieu, the immigrant striving of the Trillin family, and the humor. The book is written with so much affection that I thought I could even use it to communicate such feelings to my dad indirectly, which is the preferred route. At the very least, I thought the book might reassure my father that his messages were being received, even if they were not always heeded. About a week later, the book came back in a padded envelope with an address label supplied by his secretary. There was no note, so I wasn't sure whether he had read the book or rejected it. It seemed untouched, so I concluded that my message had gone unreceived, loose pages tossed on Rushmore. Not much escapes my father, however. It turned out that he had simply instructed his secretary to send copies to the whole family. From Philip Munger. Some of my most affectionate memories of my father are of shopping for clothes at Brooks Brothers and Marks & Spencer. Most people already know that father is not a big fashion man. He once said that he was nonconformist enough in his behavior and opinions that it made sense to chart a very straight course in attire. His going along with normal social customs and his sense of humor, he said, were what allowed his otherwise sometimes prickly temperament to harmonize with other people. I vividly recall going with my father to Brooks Brothers when it was still housed in that beautiful old wood-paneled building in downtown Los Angeles to buy my first serious suit. I must have been about 11 or 12. I can see those polished brass elevator doors opening. We looked through the racks. Father picked out a pinstriped charcoal gray suit. When I was 16, we went to buy another suit, this time a three-piece, which I wore religiously during my debate days. It kept the icy wind blowing off the lake at Northwestern during a tournament at Bay. We bought at the same time a pair of wingtip shoes for my summer stint at the Daily Journal, a coming-of-age ceremony required by father for each boy, shoes which have lasted to this day. There is another theme here. When we bought a brown tweed coat at Marks & Spencer in London, father said, "This will always keep its crease." He admired both stores because they were durable institutions, and because their merchandise was too, and fairly priced. Durability has always been a first-rate virtue in my father's view, along with ritual and tradition. He never had a desire to change his primary habits, sartorial or otherwise, once he had, like Franklin, acquired them. I still shop at Brooks, partly because each year at Christmas father gives every child a gift card, which is perfectly timed for the winter sale. But I always end up going more often than that. One year, I used his largesse to purchase trousers with pleats. My father looked at them askance and said, "Do you want to look like a jazz drummer?" In New York, Brooks is still housed in its grand old building. I think of my father every time I go. I'm very attached to the place. When I went to study at Oxford in winter 1988, he gave me an old Brooks coat of his, dating from the 40s, of a sort of tannish olive hue, I think, with a warm zip-in lining. As I walked home from the Bodleian Library each night, that nasty, damp, penetrating English cold would not get through. When I returned to the United States, I realized I'd left the coat on a bus. I wept at the loss. Even now, I wish I had that coat. Chapter 3. The Munger Approach to Life, Learning, and Decision-Making. Despite being largely self-taught, Ben Franklin was spectacularly successful in such diverse fields as journalism, publishing, printing, philanthropy, public service, science, diplomacy, and inventing. Much of Franklin's success was due to the essential nature of the man, most especially his appetite for hard work, but also his insatiable curiosity and patient demeanor. Above all, he possessed a quick and willing mind that enabled him to easily master each new field of endeavor he chose to undertake. It is not surprising that Charlie Munger considers Franklin his greatest hero, for Munger is also largely self-taught and shares many of Franklin's unique characteristics. Like Franklin, Charlie has made himself into a grand master of preparation, patience, discipline, and objectivity. He has parlayed these attributes into great success in both his personal and business endeavors, especially in his investing. To Charlie, successful investing is simply a byproduct of his carefully organized and focused approach to life. Warren Buffett once said, "Charlie can analyze and evaluate any kind of deal faster and more accurately than any man alive. He sees any valid weakness in 60 seconds. He is a perfect partner." Why does Buffett proffer such high praise? The answer lies in the markedly original approach Munger applies to life, learning, and decision-making, the principal subject of this overview. A word to the wise before we begin. Given the complexity of Charlie's approach, what follows is not intended as a how-to lesson for the aspiring investor. Instead, it is a general overview of how he seems to do it. Our goal here is to present the basic outline of Charlie's approach to prepare you for the voluminous details that follow in the rest of the book. If you are anxious to get to the heart of the matter, the 11 Talks section, presented verbatim in Charlie's own words, is the best source for exacting how-to advice on a broad range of topics. Here we will content ourselves with a presentation of the general thought processes Charlie employs when considering an investment, followed by an outline of his guiding investment principles. Munger's multiple mental models approach to business analysis and assessment. Charlie's approach to investing is quite different from the more rudimentary systems used by most investors. Instead of making a superficial standalone assessment of a company's financial information, Charlie conducts a comprehensive analysis of both the internal workings of the investment candidate as well as the larger integrated ecosystem in which it operates. He calls the tools he uses to conduct this review his multiple mental models. These models, discussed at length in several of the talks, especially talks 2, 3, and 4, serve as a framework for gathering, processing, and acting on information. They borrow from and neatly stitch together the analytical tools, methods, and formulas from such traditional disciplines as history, psychology, physiology, mathematics, engineering, biology, physics, chemistry, statistics, economics, and so on. The unassailable logic of Charlie's ecosystem approach to investment analysis: just as multiple factors shape almost every system, multiple models from a variety of disciplines applied with fluency are needed to understand that system. As John Muir observed about the interconnectedness of nature, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Charlie seeks to discover the universe hitched to each of his investment candidates by gaining a firm grasp on all, or at least most, of the relevant factors comprising both its internal and external environment. When properly collected and organized, his multiple mental models, about 100 in number, he estimates, provide a context or latticework that leads to remarkable insights as to the purpose and nature of life. More pertinent to our purpose here, his models supply the analytical structure that enables him to reduce the inherent chaos and confusion of a complex investment problem into a clarified set of fundamentals. Especially important examples of these models include the redundancy and backup system models from engineering, the compound interest model from mathematics, the breakpoint, tipping moment, and autocatalysis models from physics and chemistry, the modern Darwinian synthesis model from biology, and cognitive misjudgment models from psychology. The net result of this broad spectrum analysis is a heightened understanding of how the many factors affecting an investment candidate blend and link to one another. Sometimes this understanding reveals the existence of second-order, ripple, or spillover effects. Other times, the factors employed combine to create enormous Lollapalooza-level results, good or bad. By applying this framework, Charlie lives in a different world from most investors when it comes to investment analysis. His approach accepts the reality that investment problems are inherently complex, and in a manner more in keeping with the rigors of scientific inquiry than conventional investing, he attacks them with a staggering degree of preparation and broad-based research. Charlie's big ideas from the big disciplines approach to investment evaluation is certainly unique in the business world, as is its origin. Not finding any existing approach adequate to the task, Charlie painstakingly created his own largely self-taught system. The self-taught statement is no exaggeration. He once said, "To this day, I have never taken any course anywhere in chemistry, economics, psychology, or business." And yet these disciplines, especially psychology, form the foundation upon which his system is built. It is this signature approach, backed by Charlie's formidable intellect, temperament, and decades of relevant experience, that have made him the virtuoso of business pattern recognition so valued by Buffett. Like a chess grandmaster, through logic, instinct, and intuition, he determines the most promising investment moves, all the while projecting the illusion that the insight came easily, even simply. But make no mistake, this simplicity comes only at the end of a long journey toward understanding, not at the beginning. His clarity is hard-won, the product of a lifetime of studying the patterns of human behavior, business systems, and a myriad of other scientific disciplines. Charlie counts preparation, patience, discipline, and objectivity among his most fundamental guiding principles. He will not deviate from these principles, regardless of group dynamics, emotional itches, or popular wisdom that this time around it's different. When faithfully adhered to, these traits result in one of the best-known Munger characteristics, not buying or selling very often. Munger, like Buffett, believes a successful investment career boils down to only a handful of decisions. So when Charlie likes a business, he makes a very large bet and typically holds the position for a long period. Charlie calls it sit-on-your-ass investing and cites its benefits. You're paying less to brokers, you're listening to less nonsense, and if it works, the tax system gives you an extra 1, 2, or 3 percentage points per annum. In his view, a portfolio of 3 companies is plenty of diversification. Accordingly, Charlie is willing to commit uncommonly high percentages of his investment capital to individual, focused opportunities. Find a Wall Street organization, financial advisor, or mutual fund manager willing to make that statement. Given Charlie's record of success, not to mention Buffett's endorsement, why aren't his investment practices more routinely emulated by others? Perhaps the answer is that for most people, Charlie's multidisciplinary approach is simply too hard. Further, few investors share Charlie's willingness to appear foolish by not following the herd. Religious in his objectivity, Charlie is content to swim imperturbably against the tide of popular opinion, indefinitely if necessary, which is a rare attribute in the average investor. And while this behavior can at times appear simply stubborn or contrarian, that is not the defining characteristic. Charlie is simply content to trust his own judgment, even when it runs counter to the wisdom of the herd. This lone wolf aspect of Charlie's temperament is a rarely appreciated reason why he consistently outperforms the larger investment community. Indeed, if temperament chiefly arises from inborn tendencies, it may be that hard work, intellect, and experience, regardless of their intensity, are by themselves insufficient to make a great investor like Charlie Munger. As we shall witness through the remainder of this book, the right kind of genetically predetermined wiring is needed as well. At the 2004 Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, a young shareholder asked Buffett how to succeed in life. After Buffett shared his thoughts, Charlie chimed in, "Don't do cocaine, don't race trains, and avoid AIDS situations." Many would dismiss his seemingly flippant answer as merely humorous, which it certainly was, but in fact it faithfully reflects both his general views on avoiding trouble in life and his particular method for avoiding missteps in investing. Often, as in this case, Charlie generally focuses first on what to avoid, that is, on what not to do, before he considers the affirmative steps he will take in a given situation. "All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there," is one of his favorite quips. In business, as in life, Charlie gains enormous advantage by summarily eliminating the unpromising portions of the chessboard, freeing his time and attention for the more productive regions. Charlie strives to reduce complex situations to their most basic unemotional fundamentals. Yet within this pursuit of rationality
Well,
and
you find
simplicity, he is
yourself
careful
in a
to avoid
hole.
what he calls physics envy, the common human craving to reduce enormously complex systems, such as those in economics, to one-size-fits-all Newtonian formulas. Instead, he faithfully honors Albert Einstein's admonition: a scientific theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Or in his own words, what I'm against is being very confident and feeling that you know for sure that your particular action will do more good than harm. You're dealing with highly complex systems wherein everything is interacting with everything else. Another Benjamin, Graham, not Franklin, played a significant role in forming Charlie's investing outlook. One of the most enduring concepts in Graham's The Intelligent Investor is Mr. Market. Usually, Mr. Market is a temperate and reasonable fellow, but some days he is gripped by irrational fear or greed. Graham cautioned the investor to carefully use his own unemotional judgment of value instead of relying on the often manic-depressive behavior of the financial markets. Similarly, Charlie recognizes that even among the most competent and motivated of people, decisions are not always made on a purely rational basis. For this reason, he considers the psychological factors of human misjudgment some of the most important mental models that can be applied to an investment opportunity. Personally, I've gotten so that I now use a kind of two-track analysis. First, what are the factors that really govern the interests involved, rationally considered? And second, what are the subconscious influences where the brain at a subconscious level is automatically doing these things, which by and large are useful but which often misfunction? One approach is rationality, the way you'd work out a bridge problem, by evaluating the real interests, the real probabilities, and so forth. And the other is to evaluate the psychological factors that cause subconscious conclusions, many of which are wrong. For more specifics on this topic, see Talk 11, in which Charlie applies mental models from the field of psychology to illustrate 25 common causes of human misjudgment. Obviously, the methods described to this point can't be learned in a university classroom or on Wall Street. They were developed by Charlie from scratch to satisfy his own exacting requirements. They probably deserve a title of their own, something like quickly eliminate the big universe of what not to do, follow up with a fluent multidisciplinary attack on what remains, then act decisively when and only when the right circumstances appear. Is it worth the effort to develop and adhere to such an approach? Charlie seems to think so. It's kind of fun to sit there and outthink people who are way smarter than you are because you've trained yourself to be more objective and more multidisciplinary. Furthermore, there is a lot of money in it, as I can testify from my own personal experience. Munger's investment evaluation process. As we've noted, Charlie doesn't make a lot of investments. His approach is perhaps best summarized by Thomas Watson Sr., the founder of IBM. I'm no genius. I'm smart in spots, and I stay around those spots. If Charlie knows anything, he knows his spots, his carefully identified circles of competence. To stay within these circles, he first applies a basic overall screen designed to limit his investment field to only simple, understandable candidates. As he says, we have 3 baskets for investing: yes, no, and too tough to understand. To identify potential yes candidates, Charlie looks for an easy-to-understand, dominant business franchise that can sustain itself and thrive in all market environments. Understandably, few companies survive this first cut. Many investor favorites, such as pharmaceuticals and technology, for example, go straight to the too-tough-to-understand basket. Heavily promoted deals and IPOs earn immediate no's. Those that do survive this first winnowing are subjected to the screens and filters of Charlie's mental models approach. The process is intense and Darwinian, but also efficient. Charlie detests placer mining, the process of sifting through piles of sand for specks of gold. Instead, he applies his big ideas from the big disciplines to find the large, unrecognized nuggets of gold that sometimes lie in plain sight on the ground. Throughout his exhaustive evaluation, Charlie is no slave to a database. He takes into account all relevant aspects, both internal and external to the company and its industry, even if they are difficult to identify, measure, or reduce to numbers. His thoroughness, however, does not cause him to forget his overall ecosystem theme. Sometimes the maximization or minimization of a single factor, notably specialization, as he likes to point out regarding Costco's discount warehouses, can make that single factor disproportionately important. Charlie treats financial reports and their underlying accounting with a Midwestern dose of skepticism. At best, they are merely the beginning of a proper calculation of intrinsic valuation, not the end. The list of additional factors he examines is seemingly endless and includes such things as the current and prospective regulatory climate, the state of labor, supplier, and customer relations, the potential impact of changes in technology, competitive strengths and vulnerabilities, pricing power, scalability, environmental issues, and notably the presence of hidden exposures. Charlie knows that there is no such thing as a riskless investment candidate. He's searching for those with few risks that are easily understandable. He recasts all financial statement figures to fit his own view of reality, including the actual free or owner's cash being produced, inventory and other working capital assets, fixed assets, and such frequently overstated intangible assets as goodwill.
I'm fond of pigs.
He also completes an assessment of the true impact, current and future, of the cost of stock options, pension plans, and retiree medical benefits. He applies equal scrutiny to the liability side of the balance sheet. For example, under the right circumstances, he might view an obligation such as insurance float, premium income that may not be paid out in claims for many years, more properly as an asset. He especially assesses a company's management well beyond conventional number crunching, in particular the degree to which they are able, trustworthy, and owner-oriented. For example, how do they deploy cash? Do they allocate it intelligently on behalf of the owners, or do they overcompensate themselves or pursue ego-oriented growth for growth's sake? Above all, he attempts to assess and understand competitive advantage in every respect: products, markets, trademarks, employees, distribution channels, societal trends, and so on, and the durability of that advantage. Charlie refers to a company's competitive advantage as its moat, the virtual physical barrier it presents against incursions. Superior companies have deep moats that are continuously widened to provide enduring protection. In this vein, Charlie carefully considers competitive destruction forces that, over the long term, lay siege to most companies. Munger and Buffett are laser-focused on this issue. Over their long business careers, they have learned, sometimes painfully, that few businesses survive over multiple generations. Accordingly, they strive to identify and buy only those businesses with a good chance of beating these tough odds. Finally, Charlie seeks to calculate the intrinsic value of the whole business, and with allowance for potential dilution, etc., to determine an approximate value per share to compare to market prices. This latter comparison is the fundamental purpose of the whole process, comparing value, what you get, with price, what you pay. On this subject, he is famous for his viewpoint that a great business at a fair price is superior to a fair business at a great price. Warren Buffett often credits Charlie with convincing him of the wisdom of this approach. Charlie understood this early. I was a slow learner. Charlie's insight helped Buffett move from pure Benjamin Graham-style investing to focusing on great businesses such as the Washington Post, Geico, Coca-Cola, Gillette, and others. Though extremely thorough, Charlie is able to ignore insignificant detail and the distractions to which others sometimes fall victim. Investment variables, just like all other variables, go through their own process of elimination. By the time he is finished with his analysis, he has reduced the candidate to its most salient elements and achieved a remarkable degree of confidence about whether or not to act. The evaluation finally becomes not so much mathematical as philosophical. Ultimately, a feel emerges, a function of both the analysis itself and Charlie's lifetime of accumulated experience and skill in recognizing patterns. At this point, only an exceptionally superior investment candidate will still be in the running. But Charlie does not immediately rush out and buy it. Knowing that a necessary companion to proper valuation is proper timing, he applies yet a finer screen, a prior-to-pulling-the-trigger checklist, which is especially useful in evaluating what he refers to as close calls. The checklist includes such items as, what are the current price, volume, and trading considerations? What disclosure timing or other sensitivities exist? Do contingent exit strategies exist? Are better uses of capital currently or potentially available? Is sufficient liquid capital currently on hand, or must it be borrowed? What is the opportunity cost of that capital? And so on. Charlie's exhaustive screening process requires considerable self-discipline and results in long periods of apparent inactivity. But as Charlie says, hard work is an essential element in tracking down and perfecting a strategy or in executing it. For Charlie and Warren, the hard work is continuous, whether it results in current investing activity or not, and usually it does not. This habit of committing far more time to learning and thinking than to doing is no accident. It is the blend of discipline and patience exhibited by true masters of a craft, an uncompromising commitment to properly playing the hand. Like world-class bridge player Richard Zeckhauser, Charlie scores himself not so much on whether he won the hand, but rather on how well he played it. While poor outcomes are excusable in the Munger-Buffett world, given the fact that some outcomes are outside of their control, sloppy preparation and decision-making are never excusable because they are controllable. On those relatively few occasions when all the circumstances are just right and Charlie does invest, he will likely make a large, decisive bet. He does not pick around the edges, take initial positions, or make small, speculative investments. Such behavior implies uncertainty, and Charlie's moves, few as they are anything but uncertain. As he says, he practices extreme patience combined with extreme decisiveness. Charlie's self-confidence is based not on who or how many agree or disagree with him, but on his ability to objectively view and measure himself. This self-mastery affords him rare objectivity in gauging his actual knowledge, experience, and correctness of thought. Again, we see the important role played by the right kinds of temperamental qualities: self-discipline, patience, calm, independence. Charlie's level of investment performance is arguably impossible without them. What makes a great business model for Charlie? His recommended reading materials provide some guidance. Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Selfish Gene, Ice Age, and Darwin's Blind Spot all have a certain theme, a focus on the issue of competitive destruction and an examination of why some entities are nevertheless able to adapt, survive, and even dominate over time. When this theme is extrapolated into investment selection, the preferred Munger business emerges. Some thrive by outcompeting, a la Selfish Gene, and others by outcooperating, a la Darwin's Blind Spot. Once again, we see Charlie's rich fluency across a broad range of disciplines at work. How many investors ever consider, as Charlie routinely does, such a broad and sophisticated spectrum of factors? To name but a few, he routinely considers factors such as conversion, that is, how the laws of thermodynamics intersect with laws of economics, for instance, how paper and petroleum become a newspaper delivered to a front door, psychological tendencies and incentives, notably the extreme behavioral pressures they create, both good and bad, and fundamental sustainability over time, the constant and often deadly interplay between positive factors such as moats and the ravages of competitive destruction. Charlie is possibly without peer when it comes to the checklist of atypical investment factors he considers and his deep fluency in the diverse disciplines from which they are drawn. An investing principles checklist.
Units like Scout.
We have now examined Charlie's approach to thinking in general and to investing in particular. In keeping with our intent to observe how he seems to do it, we will recap his approach by using the checklist methodology he advocates. For Charlie's own words of wisdom on the value and importance of checklists, see Talk 5. Note, however, that the following principles are most certainly not employed by Charlie in a one-by-one or one-time fashion, as the checklist format might seem to imply. Nor can they necessarily be prioritized in terms of any apparent or relative importance. Rather, each must be considered as part of the complex whole or gestalt of the investment analysis process, in much the same way that an individual tile is integral to the larger mosaic in which it appears. Risk. All investment evaluations should begin by measuring risk, especially reputational. Incorporate an appropriate margin of safety, avoid dealing with people of questionable character, insist upon proper compensation for risk assumed, always beware of inflation and interest rate exposures, avoid big mistakes, shun permanent capital loss. Independence. Only in fairy tales are emperors told they are naked. Objectivity and rationality require independence of thought. Remember that just because other people agree or disagree with you doesn't make you right or wrong. The only thing that matters is the correctness of your analysis and judgment. Mimicking the herd invites regression to the mean, merely average performance. Preparation. The only way to win is to work, and hope to have a few insights. Develop into a lifelong self-learner through voracious reading, cultivate curiosity, and strive to become a little wiser every day. More important than the will to win is the will to prepare. Develop fluency in mental models from the major academic disciplines. If you want to get smart, the question you have to keep asking is, why? Why? Intellectual humility. Acknowledging what you don't know is the dawning of wisdom. Stay within a well-defined circle of competence. Identify and reconcile disconfirming evidence. Resist the craving for false precision, false certainties, etc. Above all, never fool yourself, and remember that you are the easiest person to fool. Analytic rigor. Use of the scientific method and effective checklists minimizes errors and omissions. Determine value apart from price, progress apart from activity, wealth apart from size. It is better to remember the obvious than to grasp the esoteric. Be a business analyst, not a market, macroeconomic, or security analyst. Consider the totality of risk and effect. Look always at potential second-order and higher-level impacts. Think forward and backward. Invert, always invert. Allocation. Proper allocation of capital is an investor's #1 job. Remember that the highest and best use is always measured by the next best use, opportunity cost. Good ideas are rare. When the odds are greatly in your favor, bet, allocate heavily. Don't fall in love with an investment. Be situation-dependent and opportunity-driven. Patience. Resist the natural human bias to act. Compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. Einstein. Never interrupt it unnecessarily. Avoid unnecessary transactional taxes and frictional costs. Never take action for its own sake. Be alert for the arrival of luck. Enjoy the process along with the proceeds, because the process is where you live. Decisiveness. When proper circumstances present themselves, act with decisiveness and conviction. Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. Opportunity doesn't come often, so seize it when it does. Opportunity meeting the prepared mind. That's the game. Change. Live with change and accept unremovable complexity. Recognize and adapt to the true nature of the world around you. Don't expect it to adapt to you. Continually challenge and willingly amend your best-loved ideas. Recognize reality even when you don't like it, especially when you don't like it. Focus. Keep things simple and remember what you set out to do. Remember that reputation and integrity are your most valuable assets and can be lost in a heartbeat. Guard against the effects of hubris and boredom. Don't overlook the obvious by drowning in minutiae. Be careful to exclude unneeded information or sloth. A small leak can sink a great ship. Face your troubles, don't sweep them under the rug. Since human beings began investing, they have been searching for a magic formula or easy recipe for instant wealth. As you can see, Charlie's superior performance doesn't come from a magic formula or some business school-inspired system. It comes from what he calls his constant search for better methods of thought, from a willingness to prepay through rigorous preparation, and from the extraordinary outcomes of his multidisciplinary research model. In the end, it comes down to Charlie's most basic guiding principles, his fundamental philosophy of life: preparation, discipline, patience, decisiveness. Each attribute is in turn lost without the other, but together they form the dynamic critical mass for a cascading of positive effects for which Munger is famous, the Lollapalooza. Finally, a word or two on why this overview of Charlie's investment philosophy has focused so much on the subject of what to buy and so little on when to sell. The answer, in Charlie's own words, serves as a wonderful summation of the Munger school of highly concentrated, focused investing described here. We're partial to putting out large amounts of money where we won't have to make another decision. If you buy something because it's undervalued, then you have to think about selling it when it approaches your calculation of its intrinsic value. That's hard. But if you can buy a few great companies, then you can sit on your ass. That's a good thing. Like his hero, Benjamin Franklin, Charlie Munger painstakingly developed and perfected unique approaches to personal and business endeavors. Through these methods, and through the development and maintenance of sound, lifelong habits, he has achieved extraordinary success. Chapter 4. 11 Talks. Charlie Munger is not the least bit shy when it comes to offering both frank criticism and constructive advice. When he sets his sights on an issue, be it a corrupt business practice, an academic failing, or a financial scandal, he lets loose with both barrels. Which is not to say he spends all his time focused on life's failings. He is equally at home discussing the values of lifelong learning or the joys of a successful marriage. But whatever the topic, Charlie is apt to tell it like it is, which is exactly what he has done in over 2 decades of public speaking. Here then are 11 of Charlie's best talks, including a special compilation he has prepared exclusively for this book. Enjoy. 1. Harvard School Commencement Speech. 2. A lesson on elementary worldly wisdom. 3. A lesson on elementary worldly wisdom revisited. 4. Practical thought about practical thought. 5. Harvard Law School 50th Reunion Address. 6. Investment practices of leading charitable foundations. 7. Philanthropy Roundtable. 8. The Great Financial Scandal of 2003. 9. Academic Economics. 10. USC Gould School of Law Commencement Address. 11. The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. A special compilation talk with material written by Charlie exclusively for this book. Talk 1. Harvard School Commencement Speech. June 13th, 1986. Harvard School, Los Angeles. In a vow that students the world over may hope he renounces, Charlie delivered the one and only graduation speech I will ever make in 1986 at the Harvard School in Los Angeles. The occasion was the graduation of Philip Munger, the last of 5 Munger family sons to matriculate at this prep school, originally an all-boys institution, and now the coeducational school called Harvard Westlake. Despite Charlie's self-effacing protestations about lacking significant public speaking experience, he demonstrates imposing rhetorical talents in this short speech. We also get a good taste of both Charlie's value system and his wit. Most graduation speakers choose to lay out a prescription for attaining a happy life. Charlie, using the inversion principle he recommends in the speech, compellingly makes the opposite case by setting forth what a graduate may do to reach a state of misery. For those of you who want to remain unenlightened and mirthless, do not, under any circumstances, read this selection. Now that Headmaster Beresford has selected one of the oldest and longest-serving trustees to make a commencement speech, it behooves the speaker to address 2 questions in every mind. 1, why was such a selection made? 2, how long is the speech going to last? I will answer the first question from long experience alongside Beresford. He is seeking enhanced reputation for our school in the manner of the man who proudly displays his horse that can count to 7. The man knows that counting to 7 is not much of a mathematical feat, but he expects approval because doing so is creditable, considering the performer is a horse. The second question, regarding the length of the speech, I am not going to answer in advance. It would deprive your upturned faces of lively curiosity and obvious keen anticipation, which I prefer to retain, regardless of source. But I will tell you how my consideration of speech length created the subject matter of the speech itself. I was puffed up when invited to speak. While not having significant public speaking experience, I do hold a black belt in chutzpah, and I immediately considered Demosthenes and Cicero as role models, and anticipated trying to earn a compliment like Cicero gave when asked which was his favorite among the orations of Demosthenes. Cicero replied, the longest one. However, fortunately for this audience, I also thought of Samuel Johnson's famous comment when he addressed Milton's poem Paradise Lost, and correctly said, no one ever wished it longer. And that made me consider which of all the 20 Harvard School graduation speeches I had heard that I had wished longer. There was only one such speech given by Johnny Carson, specifying Carson's prescriptions for guaranteed misery in life. I therefore decided to repeat Carson's speech, but in expanded form with some added prescriptions of my own. After all, I am much older than Carson was when he spoke, and I have failed and been miserable more often and in more ways than was possible for a charming humorist speaking at a younger age. I am plainly well qualified to expand on Carson's theme. What Carson said was that he couldn't tell the graduating class how to be happy, but he could tell them from personal experience how to guarantee misery. Carson's prescription for sure misery included 1, ingesting chemicals in an effort to alter mood or perception, 2, envy, 3, resentment. I can still recall Carson's absolute conviction as he told how he had tried these things on occasion after occasion and had become miserable every time. It is easy to understand Carson's first prescription for misery, ingesting chemicals. I add my voice. The 4 closest friends of my youth were highly intelligent, ethical, humorous types, favored in person and background. 2 are long dead, with alcohol a contributing factor, and the 3rd is a living alcoholic, if you call that living. While susceptibility varies, addiction can happen to any of us through a subtle process where the bonds of degradation are too light to be felt until they are too strong to be broken. And yet, I have yet to meet anyone in over 6 decades of life whose life was worsened by fear and avoidance of such a deceptive pathway to destruction. Envy, of course, joins chemicals in winning some sort of quantity prize for causing misery. It was wreaking havoc long before it got bad press in the laws of Moses. If you wish to retain the contribution of envy to misery, I recommend that you never read any of the biographies of that good Christian Samuel Johnson, because his life demonstrates in an enticing way the possibility and advantage of transcending envy. Resentment has always worked for me exactly as it worked for Carson. I cannot recommend it highly enough to you if you desire misery. Johnson spoke well when he said that life is hard enough to swallow without squeezing in the bitter rind of resentment. For those of you who want misery, I also recommend refraining from the practice of the Disraeli Compromise, designed for people who find it impossible to quit resentment cold turkey. Benjamin Disraeli, as he rose to become one of the greatest prime ministers, learned to give up vengeance as a motivation for action, but he did retain some outlet for resentment by putting the names of people who wronged him on pieces of paper in a drawer. Then, from time to time, he reviewed these names and took pleasure in noting the way the world had taken his enemies down without his assistance. Well, so much for Carson's 3 prescriptions. Here are 4 more prescriptions from Munger. First, be unreliable. Do not faithfully do what you have engaged to do. If you will only master this one habit, you will more than counterbalance the combined effect of all your virtues, howsoever great. If you like being distrusted and excluded from the best human contribution and company, this prescription is for you. Master this one habit, and you will always play the role of the hare in the fable, except that instead of being outrun by one fine turtle, you will be outrun by hordes and hordes of mediocre turtles, and even some mediocre turtles on crutches. I must warn you that if you don't follow my first prescription, it may be hard to end up miserable even if you start disadvantaged. I had a roommate in college who was and is severely dyslexic, but he is perhaps the most reliable man I have ever known. He has had a wonderful life so far, an outstanding wife and children, chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. If you want to avoid a conventional, main culture establishment result of this kind, you simply can't count on your other handicaps to hold you back if you persist in being reliable. I cannot here pass by a reference to a life described as wonderful so far without reinforcing the so far aspects of the human condition by repeating the remark of Croesus, once the richest king in the world. Later, in ignominious captivity, as he prepared to be burned alive, he said, Well, now do I remember the words of the historian Solon. No man's life should be accounted a happy one until it is over. My second prescription for misery is to learn everything you possibly can from your own experience, minimizing what you learn vicariously from the good and bad experiences of others, living and dead. This prescription is a sure-shot producer of misery and second-rate achievement. You can see the results of not learning from others' mistakes by simply looking about you. How little originality there is in the common disasters of mankind. Drunk driving deaths, reckless driving maimings, incurable venereal diseases, conversion of bright college students into brainwashed zombies as members of destructive cults, business failures through repetition of obvious mistakes made by predecessors, various forms of crowd folly, and so on. I recommend as a memory clue to finding the way to real trouble from heedless, unoriginal error, the modern saying, if at first you don't succeed, well, so much for hang gliding. The other aspect of avoiding vicarious wisdom is the rule of not learning from the best work done before yours. The prescription is to become as non-educated as you reasonably can. Perhaps you will better see the type of non-miserable result you can thus avoid if I render a short historical account. There once was a man who assiduously mastered the work of his best predecessors, despite a poor start and very tough time in analytical geometry. Eventually, his own work attracted wide attention, and he said of his work, "If I have seen a little farther than other men, it is because I stood on the shoulders of giants." The bones of that man lie buried now in Westminster Abbey under an unusual inscription. Here lie the remains of all that was mortal in Sir Isaac Newton. My third prescription to you for misery is to go down and stay down when you get your first, second, or third severe reverse in the battle of life. Because there is so much adversity out there, even for the lucky and wise, this will guarantee that in due course you will be permanently mired in misery. Ignore at all cost the lesson contained in the accurate epitaph written for himself by Epictetus. Here lies Epictetus, a slave, maimed in body, the ultimate in poverty, and favored by the gods. My final prescription to you for a life of fuzzy thinking and infelicity is to ignore a story they told me when I was very young about a rustic who said, "I wish I knew where I was going to die and then I'd never go there." Most people smile as you did at the rustic's ignorance and ignore his basic wisdom. If my experience is any guide, the rustic's approach is to be avoided at all cost by someone bent on misery. To help fail, you should discount as mere quirk, with no useful message, the method of the rustic, which is the same one used in Carson's speech. What Carson did was to approach the study of how to create X by turning the question backward. That is, by studying how to create non-X. The great algebraist Jacobi had exactly the same approach as Carson and was known for his constant repetition of one phrase: invert, always invert. It is in the nature of things, as Jacobi knew, that many hard problems are best solved only when they are addressed backward. For instance, when almost everyone else was trying to revise the electromagnetic laws of James Clerk Maxwell to be consistent with the motion laws of Newton, Einstein discovered special relativity as he made a 180-degree turn and revised Newton's laws to fit Maxwell's. It is my opinion, as a certified biography nut, that Charles Robert Darwin would have ranked near the middle of the Harvard School graduating class of 1986. Yet he is now famous in the history of science. This is precisely the type of example you should learn nothing from if bent on minimizing your results from your own endowment. Darwin's result was due in large measure to his working method, which violated all my rules for misery, and particularly emphasized a backward twist in that he always gave priority attention to evidence tending to disconfirm whatever cherished and hard-won theory he already had. In contrast, most people early achieve and later intensify a tendency to process new and disconfirming information so that any original conclusion remains intact. They become people of whom Philip Wiley observed, "You couldn't squeeze a dime between what they already know and what they will never learn." The life of Darwin demonstrates how a turtle may outrun a hare, aided by extreme objectivity, which helps the objective person end up like the only player without a blindfold in a game of pin the tail on the donkey. If you minimize objectivity, you ignore not only a lesson from Darwin, but also one from Einstein. Einstein said that his successful theories came from curiosity, concentration, perseverance, and self-criticism. And by self-criticism, he meant the testing and destruction of his own well-loved ideas. Finally, minimizing objectivity will help you lessen the compromises and burden of owning worldly goods. Because objectivity does not work only for great physicists and biologists, it also adds power to the work of a plumbing contractor in Bemidji. Therefore, if you interpret being true to yourself as requiring that you retain every notion of your youth, you will be safely underway, not only toward maximizing ignorance, but also toward whatever misery can be obtained through unpleasant experiences in business. It is fitting that a backward sort of speech end with a backward sort of toast, inspired by Elihu Root's repeated accounts of how the dog went to Dover, leg over leg. To the class of 1986, gentlemen, may each of you rise by spending each day of a long life aiming low. Talk 1 Revisited. As I review in 2006 this talk made in 1986, I would not revise a single idea. If anything, I now believe even more strongly that 1, reliability is essential for progress in life, and 2, while quantum mechanics is unlearnable for a vast majority, reliability can be learned to great advantage by almost anyone. Indeed, I have often made myself unpopular on elite college campuses by pushing this reliability theme. What I say is that McDonald's is one of our most admirable institutions. Then, as signs of shock come to surrounding faces, I explain that McDonald's, providing first jobs to millions of teenagers, many troubled over the years, has successfully taught most of them the one lesson they most need: to show up reliably for responsible work. Then I usually go on to say that if the elite campuses were as successful as McDonald's in teaching sensibly, we would have a better world. Talk 2. a lesson on elementary worldly wisdom as it relates to investment management and business. April 14th, 1994, the University of Southern California, Marshall School of Business.
Military knowledge.
Well known because it was published in Outstanding Investor Digest, May 5th, 1995, this talk was given in 1994 to Professor Guilford Babcock's business class at the University of Southern California. Charlie ranges in the talk from education systems to psychology to the importance of possessing both common and uncommon sense. Dissecting business management, he brilliantly describes psychological impacts that can damage or benefit a firm. He also presents an outstanding set of principles for investment, business management, and, most importantly, from Charlie's perspective, decision-making in everyday life. Your time investment in reading this talk will be paid back quickly via the effect it will have on your own decision-making abilities. I'm going to play a minor trick on you today because the subject of my talk is the art of stock picking as a subdivision of the art of worldly wisdom. That enables me to start talking about worldly wisdom, a much broader topic that interests me because I think all too little of it is delivered by modern educational systems, at least in an effective way. And therefore, the talk is sort of along the lines that some behaviorist psychologists call Grandma's Rule, after the wisdom of Grandma when she said that you have to eat the carrots before you get the dessert. The carrot part of this talk is about the general subject of worldly wisdom, which is a pretty good way to start. After all, the theory of modern education is that you need a general education before you specialize. And I think to some extent, before you're going to be a great stock picker, you need some general education. So, emphasizing what I sometimes waggishly call remedial worldly wisdom, I'm going to start by waltzing you through a few basic notions. What is elementary worldly wisdom? Well, the first rule is that you can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts and try and bang them back. If the facts don't hang together on the latticework of theory, you don't have them in a usable form. You've got to have models in your head, and you've got to array your experience, both vicarious and direct, on this latticework of models. You may have noticed students who just try to remember and pound back what is remembered. Well, they fail in school and fail in life. You've got to hang experience on a latticework of models in your head. What are the models? Well, the first rule is that you've got to have multiple models, because if you have just one or two that you're using, the nature of human psychology is such that you'll torture reality so that it fits your models, or at least you'll think it does. You become the equivalent of a chiropractor who, of course, is the great boob in medicine. It's like the old saying, to the man with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And of course, that's the way the chiropractor goes about practicing medicine. But that's a perfectly disastrous way to think, and a perfectly disastrous way to operate in the world. So you've got to have multiple models. And the models have to come from multiple disciplines, because all the wisdom of the world is not to be found in one little academic department. That's why poetry professors, by and large, are so unwise in a worldly sense. They don't have enough models in their heads, so you've got to have models across a fair array of disciplines. You may say, my God, this is already getting way too tough. But fortunately, it isn't that tough, because 80 or 90 important models will carry about 90% of the freight in making you a worldly wise person. And of those, only a mere handful really carry very heavy freight. So, let's briefly review what kinds of models and techniques constitute this basic knowledge that everybody has to have before they proceed to being really good at a narrow art like stock picking. First, there's mathematics. Obviously, you've got to be able to handle numbers and quantities, basic arithmetic. And the great useful model after compound interest is the elementary math of permutations and combinations. That was taught in my day in the sophomore year in high school. I suppose by now, in great private schools, it's probably down to the 8th grade or so. It's very simple algebra. And it was all worked out in the course of about 1 year in correspondence between Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat. They worked it out casually in a series of letters. It's not that hard to learn. What is hard is to get so you use it routinely almost every day of your life. The Fermat-Pascal system is dramatically consonant with the way the world works, and it's a fundamental truth, so you simply have to have the technique. Many educational institutions, although not nearly enough, have realized this. At Harvard Business School, the great quantitative thing that bonds the first-year class together is what they call decision tree theory. All they do is take high school algebra and apply it to real-life problems, and the students love it. They're amazed to find that high school algebra works in life. By and large, as it works out, people can't naturally and automatically do this. If you understand elementary psychology, the reason they can't is really quite simple. The basic neural network of the brain is there through broad genetic and cultural evolution, and it's not Fermat-Pascal. It uses a very crude shortcut type of approximation. It's got elements of Fermat-Pascal in it, however, it's not good. So you have to learn in a very usable way this very elementary math and use it routinely in life. Just the way that if you want to become a golfer, you can't use the natural swing that broad evolution gave you. You have to learn to have a certain grip and swing in a different way, realize your full potential as a golfer. If you don't get this elementary but mildly unnatural mathematics of elementary probability into your repertoire, then you go through a long life like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. You're giving a huge advantage to everybody else. One of the advantages of a fellow like Buffett, whom I've worked with all these years, is that he automatically thinks in terms of decision trees and the elementary math of permutations and combinations. Obviously, you have to know accounting. It's the language of practical business life. It was a very useful thing to deliver to civilization. I've heard it came to civilization through Venice, which of course was once the great commercial power in the Mediterranean. However, double-entry bookkeeping was a hell of an invention. And it's not that hard to understand, but you have to know enough about it to understand its limitations. Because although accounting is the starting place, it's only a crude approximation. And it's not very hard to understand its limitations. For example, everyone can see that you have to more or less just guess at the useful life of a jet airplane or anything like that. Just because you express the depreciation rate in neat numbers doesn't make it anything you really know. In terms of the limitations of accounting, one of my favorite stories involves a very great businessman named Carl Braun, who created the C.F. Braun Engineering Company. It designed and built oil refineries, which is very hard to do, and Braun would get them to come in on time and not blow up and have efficiencies and so forth. This is a major art. Braun, being the thorough Teutonic type that he was, had a number of quirks. One of them was that he took a look at standard accounting and the way it was applied to building oil refineries, and he said, this is asinine. So he threw all of his accountants out, and he took his engineers and said, now we'll devise our own system of accounting to handle this process. And in due time, accounting adopted a lot of Carl Braun's notions. So he was a formidably willful and talented man who demonstrated both the importance of accounting and the importance of knowing its limitations. He had another rule from psychology, which, if you're interested in wisdom, ought to be part of your repertoire, like the elementary mathematics of permutations and combinations. His rule for all the Braun Company's communications was called the 5 W's. You had to tell who was going to do what, where, when, and why. And if you wrote a letter or directive in the Braun Company telling somebody to do something and you didn't tell him why, you could get fired. In fact, you would get fired if you did it twice. You might ask, why is that so important? Well, again, that's a rule of psychology. Just as you think better if you array knowledge on a bunch of models that are basically answers to the question, why, if you always tell people why, they'll understand it better. They'll consider it more important, and they'll be more likely to comply. Even if they don't understand your reason, they'll be more likely to comply. So there's an iron rule that just as you want to start getting worldly wisdom by asking why, in communicating with other people about everything, you want to include why. Even if it's obvious, it's wise to stick in the why. Which models are the most reliable? Well, obviously, the models that come from hard science and engineering are the most reliable models on this earth. And engineering quality control, at least the guts of it that matters to you and me and people who are not professional engineers, is very much based on the elementary mathematics of Fermat and Pascal. It costs so much, and you get so much less likelihood of it breaking if you spend this much. It's all elementary high school mathematics, and an elaboration of that is what W. Edwards Deming brought to Japan for all of that quality control stuff. I don't think it's necessary for most people to be terribly facile in statistics. For example, I'm not sure that I can even pronounce the Gaussian distribution, although I know what it looks like, and I know that events and huge aspects of reality end up distributed that way. So I can do a rough calculation. But if you ask me to work out something involving a Gaussian distribution to 10 decimal points, I can't sit down and do the math. I'm like a poker player who's learned to play pretty well without mastering Pascal. And by the way, that works well enough. But you have to understand that bell-shaped curve at least roughly as well as I do. And of course, the engineering idea of a backup system is a very powerful idea. The engineering idea of breakpoints, that's a very powerful model too. The notion of a critical mass that comes out of physics is a very powerful model. All of these things have great utility in looking at ordinary reality. And all of this cost-benefit analysis, hell, that's all elementary high school algebra. It's just been dolled up a little bit with fancy lingo. And you can demonstrate that point quite simply. There's not a person in this room viewing the work of a very ordinary professional magician who doesn't see a lot of things happening that aren't happening and not see a lot of things happening that are happening. I suppose the next most reliable models are from biology and physiology, because after all of us are programmed by our genetic makeup to be much the same. Then when you get into psychology, of course, it gets very much more complicated. But it's an ungodly important subject if you're going to have any worldly wisdom. And the reason why is that the perceptual apparatus of man has shortcuts in it. The brain cannot have unlimited circuitry. So someone who knows how to take advantage of those shortcuts and cause the brain to miscalculate in certain ways can cause you to see things that aren't there. Now you get into the cognitive function as distinguished from the perceptual function. And there you are equally, more than equally in fact, likely to be misled. Again, your brain has a shortage of circuitry and so forth, and it's taking all kinds of little automatic shortcuts. So when circumstances combine in certain ways, or more commonly, when your fellow man starts acting like the magician and manipulates you on purpose by causing you cognitive dysfunction, you're a patsy. And so just as a man working with a tool has to know its limitations, a man working with his cognitive apparatus has to know its limitations. And this knowledge, by the way, can be used to control and motivate other people. So the most useful and practical part of psychology, which I personally think can be taught to any intelligent person in a week, is ungodly important. And nobody taught it to me, by the way. I had to learn it later in life, one piece at a time. And it was fairly laborious. It's so elementary, though, that when it was all over, I just felt like a total horse's ass. And yeah, I've been educated at Caltech and the Harvard Law School and so forth. So very eminent places miseducated people like you and me. The elementary part of psychology, the psychology of misjudgment, as I call it, is a terribly important thing to learn. There are about 20 little principles, and they interact, so it gets slightly complicated, but the guts of it is unbelievably important. Terribly smart people make totally bonkers mistakes by failing to pay heed to it. In fact, I've done it several times during the last 2 or 3 years in a very important way. You never get totally over making silly mistakes. There's another saying that comes from Pascal that I've always considered one of the really accurate observations in the history of thought. Pascal said, "The mind of man at one and the same time is both the glory and the shame of the universe." And that's exactly right. It has this enormous power. However, it also has these standard misfunctions that often cause it to reach wrong conclusions. It also makes man extraordinarily subject to manipulation by others. For example, roughly half of the army of Adolf Hitler was composed of believing Catholics. Given enough clever psychological manipulation, what human beings will do is quite interesting. Personally, I've gotten so that I now use a kind of two-track analysis. First, what are the factors that really govern the interests involved, rationally considered? And second, what are the subconscious influences where the brain, at a subconscious level, is automatically doing these things, which by and large are useful but which often misfunction? One approach is rationality, the way you'd work out a bridge problem, by evaluating the real interests, the real probabilities, and so forth. and the other is to evaluate the psychological factors that cause subconscious conclusions, many of which are wrong. Now we come to another somewhat less reliable form of human wisdom, microeconomics. Here I find it quite useful to think of a free market economy, or a partly free market economy, as sort of the equivalent of an ecosystem. This is a very unfashionable way of thinking, because early in the days after Darwin came along, people like the robber barons assumed that the doctrine of the survival of the fittest authenticated them as deserving power. You know, I'm the richest, therefore I'm the best, God's in his heaven, etc. And that reaction of the robber barons was so irritating to people that it made it unfashionable to think of an economy as an ecosystem. But the truth is that it is a lot like an ecosystem, and you get many of the same results. Just as in an ecosystem, people who narrowly specialize can get terribly good at occupying some little niche. Just as animals flourish in niches, people who specialize in the business world and get very good because they specialize frequently find good economics that they wouldn't get any other way. And once we get into microeconomics, we get into the concept of advantages of scale. Now we're getting closer to investment analysis, because in terms of which businesses succeed and which businesses fail, advantages of scale are ungodly important. For example, one great advantage of scale taught in all of the business schools of the world is cost reductions along the so-called experience curve. Just doing something complicated in more and more volume enables human beings who are trying to improve and are motivated by the incentives of capitalism to do it more and more efficiently. The very nature of things is that if you get a whole lot of volume through your operation, you get better at processing that volume. That's an enormous advantage, and it has a lot to do with which businesses succeed and fail. Let's go through a list, albeit an incomplete one, of possible advantages of scale. Some come from simple geometry. If you're building a great circular tank, obviously, as you build it bigger, the amount of steel you use in the surface goes up with the square, and the cubic volume goes up with the cube. So as you increase the dimensions, you can hold a lot more volume per unit area of steel. There are all kinds of things like that where the simple geometry, the simple reality, gives you an advantage of scale. For example, you can get advantages of scale from TV advertising. When TV advertising first arrived, when talking color pictures first came into our living rooms, it was an unbelievably powerful thing. And in the early days, we had 3 networks that had whatever it was, say 90% of the audience. Well, if you were Procter & Gamble, you could afford to use this new method of advertising. You could afford the very expensive cost of network television because you were selling so damn many cans and bottles. Some little guy couldn't. And there was no way of buying it in part, therefore he couldn't use it. In effect, if you didn't have a big volume, you couldn't use network TV advertising, which was the most effective technique. So when TV came in, the branded companies that were already big got a huge tailwind. Indeed, they prospered and prospered and prospered until some of them got fat and foolish, which happens with prosperity, at least to some people. And your advantage of scale can be an informational advantage. If I go to some remote place, I may see Wrigley chewing gum alongside Glotz's chewing gum. Well, I know that Wrigley is a satisfactory product, whereas I don't know anything about Glotz's. So if one is 40 cents and the other is 30 cents, am I going to take something I don't know and put it in my mouth, which is a pretty personal place, after all, for a lousy dime? So in effect, Wrigley, simply by being so well known, has advantages of scale, what you might call an informational advantage. Another advantage of scale comes from psychology. Psychologists use the term social proof. We are all influenced, subconsciously and to some extent consciously, by what we see others do and approve. Therefore, if everybody's buying something, we think it's better. We don't like to be the one guy who's out of step. Again, some of this is at a subconscious level and some of it isn't. Sometimes we consciously and rationally think, gee, I don't know much about this. They know more than I do. Therefore, why shouldn't I follow them? The social proof phenomenon, which comes right out of psychology, gives huge advantages to scale. For example, with very wide distribution, which of course is hard to get. One advantage of Coca-Cola is that it's available almost everywhere in the world. Well, suppose you have a little soft drink. Exactly how do you make it available all over the earth? The worldwide distribution setup, which is slowly won by a big enterprise, gets to be a huge advantage. And if you think about it, once you get enough advantages of that type, it can become very hard for anybody to dislodge you. There's another kind of advantage to scale. In some businesses, the very nature of things is to sort of cascade toward the overwhelming dominance of one firm. The most obvious one is daily newspapers. There's practically no city left in the United States, aside from a few very big ones, where there's more than one daily newspaper. And again, that's a scale thing. Once I get most of the circulation, I get most of the advertising. And once I get most of the advertising and circulation, why would anyone want the thinner paper with less information in it? So it tends to cascade to a winner-take-all situation. And that's a separate form of the advantages of scale phenomenon. Similarly, all these huge advantages of scale allow greater specialization within the firm. Therefore, each person can be better at what he does. And these advantages of scale are so great, for example, that when Jack Welch came into General Electric, he just said, to hell with it. We're either going to be number 1 or number 2 in every field we're in, or we're going to be out. I don't care how many people I have to fire and what I have to sell. We're going to be number 1 or number 2 or out. That was a very tough-minded thing to do, but I think it was a very correct decision if you're thinking about maximizing shareholder wealth. And I don't think it's a bad thing to do for a civilization either, because I think that General Electric is stronger for having Jack Welch there. And there are also disadvantages of scale. For example, we, by which I mean Berkshire Hathaway, are the largest shareholder in Capital Cities ABC. And we had trade publications there that got murdered where our competitors beat us. And the way they beat us was by going to a narrower specialization. We'd have a travel magazine for business travel, so somebody would create one that was addressed solely at corporate travel departments. Like an ecosystem, we're getting a narrower and narrower specialization. Well, they got much more efficient. They could tell more to the guys who ran corporate travel departments. Plus, they didn't have to waste the ink and paper mailing out stuff that corporate travel departments weren't interested in reading. It was a more efficient system, and they beat our brains out as we relied on our broader magazine. That's what happened to the Saturday Evening Post and all those things. They're gone. What we have now is motocross, which is read by a bunch of nuts who like to participate in tournaments where they turn somersaults on their motorcycles, but they care about it. For them, it's the principal purpose of life. A magazine called Motocross is a total necessity to those people, and its profit margins would make you salivate. Just think of how narrow-cast that kind of publishing is. So occasionally, scaling down and intensifying gives you the big advantage. Bigger is not always better. The great defect of scale, of course, which makes the game interesting, so that the big people don't always win, is that as you get big, you get the bureaucracy. And with the bureaucracy comes the territoriality, which is again grounded in human nature. And the incentives are perverse. For example, if you worked for AT&T in my day, it was a great bureaucracy. Who in the hell was really thinking about the shareholder or anything else? And in a bureaucracy, you think the work is done when it goes out of your in-basket into somebody else's in-basket. But of course it isn't. It's not done until AT&T delivers what it's supposed to deliver. So you get big, fat, dumb, unmotivated bureaucracies. They also tend to become somewhat corrupt. In other words, if I've got a department and you've got a department and we kind of share power running this thing, there's sort of an unwritten rule. If you won't bother me, I won't bother you, and we're both happy. So you get layers of management and associated costs that nobody needs. Then, while people are justifying all these layers, it takes forever to get anything done. They're too slow to make decisions, and nimbler people run circles around them. The constant curse of scale is that it leads to big, dumb bureaucracy, which of course reaches its highest and worst form in government, where the incentives are really awful. That doesn't mean we don't need governments, because we do, but it's a terrible problem to get big bureaucracies to behave. So people go to stratagems. They create little decentralized units and fancy motivation and training programs. For example, for a big company, General Electric has fought bureaucracy with amazing skill, but that's because they have a combination of a genius and a fanatic running it. And they put him in young enough so he gets a long run. Of course, that's Jack Welch. But bureaucracy is terrible. And as things get very powerful and very big, you can get some really dysfunctional behavior. Look at Westinghouse. They blew billions of dollars on a bunch of dumb loans to real estate developers. They put in some guy who'd come up by some career path. I don't know exactly what it was, but it could have been refrigerators or something. And all of a sudden, he's loaning money to real estate developers building hotels. It's a very unequal contest. And in due time, they lost all those billions of dollars. CBS provides an interesting example of another rule of psychology, namely Pavlovian association. If people tell you what you really don't want to hear, what's unpleasant, there's an almost automatic reaction of antipathy. You have to train yourself out of it. It isn't foredestined that you have to be this way, but you will tend to be this way if you don't think about it. Television was dominated by one network, CBS, in its early days, and William S. Paley was a god, but he didn't like to hear what he didn't like to hear, and people soon learned that. So they told Paley only what he liked to hear. Therefore, he was soon living in a little cocoon of unreality, and everything else was corrupt, although it was a great business. So the idiocy that crept into the system was carried along by this huge tide. It was a Mad Hatter's Tea Party the last 10 years under Bill Paley. And that is not the only example by any means. You can get severe misfunction in the high ranks of business. And of course, if you're investing, it can make a hell of a lot of difference. If you take all the acquisitions that CBS made under Paley after the acquisition of the network itself, with all his dumb advisors, his investment bankers, management consultants, and so forth, who were getting paid very handsomely, it was absolutely terrible. So life is an everlasting battle between those two forces. To get these advantages of scale on one side, and a tendency to get a lot like the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the other side, where they just sit around and so forth. I don't know exactly what they do. However, I do know they do very little useful work. On the subject of the advantages of economies of scale, I find chain stores quite interesting. Just think about it. The concept of a chain store was a fascinating invention. You get this huge purchasing power, which means that you have lower merchandise costs. You get a whole bunch of little laboratories out there in which you can conduct experiments. And you get specialization. If one little guy is trying to buy across 27 different merchandise categories influenced by traveling salesmen, he's going to make a lot of dumb decisions. But if your buying is done in headquarters for a huge bunch of stores, you can get very bright people who know a lot about refrigerators and so forth to do the buying. The reverse is demonstrated by the little store, where one guy is doing all the buying. It's like the old story about the little store with salt all over its walls. A stranger comes in and says to the store owner, "You must sell a lot of salt." And he replies, "No, I don't, but you should see the guy who sells me salt." So there are huge purchasing advantages. And then there are the slick systems of forcing everyone to do what works. So a chain store can be a fantastic enterprise. It's quite interesting to think about Walmart starting from a single store in Arkansas against Sears Roebuck with its name, reputation, and all its billions. How does a guy in Bentonville, Arkansas with no money blow right by Sears Roebuck? And he does it in his own lifetime. In fact, during his own late lifetime, because he was already pretty old by the time he started out with one little store. He played the chain store game harder and better than anyone else. Sam Walton invented practically nothing, but he copied everything anybody else ever did that was smart. And he did it with more fanaticism and better employee manipulation, so he just blew right by them all. He also had a very interesting competitive strategy in the early days. He was like a prize fighter who wanted a great record so he could be in the finals and make a big TV hit. So what did he do? He went out and fought 42 palookas, right? And the result was knockout, 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 42 times. Walton, being as shrewd as he was, basically broke other small-town merchants in the early days. With his more efficient system, he might not have been able to tackle some titan head-on at the time, but with his better system, he could sure as hell destroy those small-town merchants. And he went around doing it time after time after time. Then, as he got bigger, he started destroying the big boys. Well, that was a very, very shrewd strategy. You can say, is this a nice way to behave? Well, capitalism is a pretty brutal place. But I personally think that the world is better for having Walmart. I mean, you can idealize small-town life, but I've spent a fair amount of time in small towns. And let me tell you, you shouldn't get too idealistic about all those businesses he destroyed. Plus, a lot of people who work at Walmart are very high-grade, bouncy people who are raising nice children. I have no feeling that an inferior culture destroyed a superior culture. I think that is nothing more than nostalgia and delusion. But at any rate, it's an interesting model of how the scale of things and fanaticism combine to be very powerful. And it's also an interesting model on the other side. how with all its great advantages, the disadvantages of bureaucracy did such terrible damage to Sears Roebuck. Sears had layers and layers of people it didn't need. It was very bureaucratic. It was slow to think. And there was an established way of thinking. If you poked your head up with a new thought, the system kind of turned against you. It was everything in the way of a dysfunctional big bureaucracy that you would expect. In all fairness, there was also much that was good about it, but it just wasn't as lean and mean and shrewd and effective as Sam Walton. And in due time, all Sears's advantages of scale were not enough to prevent it from losing heavily to Walmart and other similar retailers. Here's a model that we've had trouble with. Maybe you'll be able to figure it out better. Many markets get down to 2 or 3 big competitors, or 5 or 6. And in some of those markets, nobody makes any money to speak of, but in others, everybody does very well. Over the years, we've tried to figure out why the competition in some markets gets sort of rational from the investor's point of view, so that the shareholders do well, while in other markets there's destructive competition that destroys shareholder wealth. If it's a pure commodity like airline seats, you can understand why no one makes any money. As we sit here, just think of what airlines have given to the world. Safe travel, greater experience, time with your loved ones, you name it. Yet the net amount of money that's been made by the shareholders of airlines since Kitty Hawk is now a negative figure. A substantial negative figure. Competition was so intense that once it was unleashed by deregulation, it ravaged shareholder wealth in the airline business. Yet in other fields, like cereals, for example, almost all the big boys make out. If you're some kind of a medium-grade cereal maker, you might get 15% on your capital, and if you're really good, you might make 40%. But why are cereals so profitable, despite the fact that it looks to me like they're competing like crazy with promotions, coupons, and everything else? I don't fully understand it. Obviously, there's a brand identity factor in cereals that doesn't exist in airlines. That must be the main factor that accounts for it. And maybe the cereal makers, by and large, have learned to be less crazy about fighting for market share. Because if you get even one person who's hell-bent on gaining market share, for example, if I were Kellogg and I decided that I had to have 60% of the market, I think I could take most of the profit out of cereals. I'd ruin Kellogg in the process, but I think I could do it. In some businesses, the participants behave like a demented Kellogg. In other businesses, they don't. Unfortunately, I do not have a perfect model for predicting how that's going to happen. For example, if you look around at bottler markets, you'll find many markets where bottlers of Pepsi and Coke both make a lot of money, and many others where they destroy most of the profitability of the two franchises. That must get down to the peculiarities of individual adjustment to market capitalism. I think you'd have to know the people involved to fully understand what was happening. In microeconomics, of course, you've got the concept of patents, trademarks, exclusive franchises, and so forth. Patents are quite interesting. When I was young, I think more money went into patents than came out. Judges tended to throw them out based on arguments about what was really invented and what relied on prior art. That isn't altogether clear, but they changed that. They didn't change the laws, they just changed the administration, so that it all goes to one patent court. And that court is now very much more pro-patent. So I think people are now starting to make a lot of money out of owning patents. Trademarks, of course, have always made people a lot of money. A trademark system is a wonderful thing for a big operation if it's well known. The exclusive franchise can also be wonderful. If there were only 3 television channels awarded in a big city and you owned one of them, there were only so many hours a day that you could be on. So you had a natural position in an oligopoly in the pre-cable days. And if you get the franchise for the only food stand in an airport, you have a captive clientele and you have a small monopoly of a sort. The great lesson in microeconomics is to discriminate between when technology is going to help you and when it's going to kill you. And most people do not get this straight in their heads. But a fellow like Buffett does. For example, when we were in the textile business, which is a terrible commodity business, we were making low-end textiles, which are a real commodity product. And one day the people came to Warren and said, they've invented a new loom that we think will do twice as much work as our old ones. And Warren said, gee, I hope this doesn't work, because if it does, I'm going to close the mill. And he meant it. What was he thinking? He was thinking, it's a lousy business. We're earning substandard returns and keeping it open just to be nice to the elderly workers. But we're not going to put huge amounts of new capital into a lousy business. And he knew that the huge productivity increases that would come from a better machine introduced into the production of a commodity product would all go to the benefit of the buyers of the textiles. Nothing was going to stick to our ribs as owners. That's such an obvious concept, that there are all kinds of wonderful new inventions that give you nothing as owners except the opportunity to spend a lot more money in a business that's still going to be lousy. The money still won't come to you. All of the advantages from great improvements are going to flow through to the customers. Conversely, if you own the only newspaper in Oshkosh and they were to invent more efficient ways of composing the whole newspaper, then when you got rid of the old technology and got new fancy computers and so forth, all of the savings would come right through to the bottom line. In all cases, the people who sell the machinery, and by and large even the internal bureaucrats urging you to buy the equipment, show you projections with the amount you'll save at current prices with the new technology. However, they don't do the second step of the analysis, which is to determine how much is going to stay home and how much is just going to flow through to the customer. I've never seen a single projection incorporating that second step in my life. And I see them all the time. Rather, they always read, this capital outlay will save you so much money that it will pay for itself in 3 years. So you keep buying things that will pay for themselves in 3 years. And after 20 years of doing it, somehow you've earned a return of only about 4% per annum. That's the textile business. And it isn't that the machines weren't better, it's just that the savings didn't go to you. The cost reductions came through, all right, but the benefit of the cost reductions didn't go to the guy who bought the equipment. It's such a simple idea, it's so basic, and yet it's so often forgotten. Then there's another model from microeconomics that I find very interesting. When technology moves as fast as it does in a civilization like ours, you get a phenomenon that I call competitive destruction. You know, you have the finest buggy whip factory, and all of a sudden in comes this little horseless carriage. And before too many years go by, your buggy whip business is dead. You either get into a different business or you're dead, you're destroyed. It happens again and again and again. And when these new businesses come in, there are huge advantages for the early birds. When you're an early bird, there's a model that I call surfing. When a surfer gets up and catches the wave and just stays there, he can go a long, long time. But if he gets off the wave, he becomes mired in shallows. But people get long runs when they're right on the edge of the wave, whether it's Microsoft or Intel or all kinds of people, including National Cash Register in the early days. The cash register was one of the great contributions to civilization. It's a wonderful story. John Henry Patterson was a small retail merchant who didn't make any money. One day, somebody sold him a crude cash register, which he put into his retail operation. And it instantly changed from losing money to earning a profit, because it made it so much harder for the employees to steal. But Patterson, having the kind of mind that he did, didn't think, oh, good for my retail business. He thought, I'm going into the cash register business. And of course, he created National Cash Register, and he surfed. He got the best distribution system, the biggest collection of patents, and the best of everything. He was a fanatic about everything important as the technology developed. I have in my files an early National Cash Register Company report in which Patterson described his methods and objectives. And a well-educated orangutan could see that buying into a partnership with Patterson in those early days, given his notions about the cash register business, was a total 100% cinch. And of course, that's exactly what an investor should be looking for. In a long life, you can expect to profit heavily from at least a few of those opportunities if you develop the wisdom and will to seize them. At any rate, surfing is a very powerful model. However, Berkshire Hathaway, by and large, does not invest in these people who are surfing on complicated technology. After all, we're cranky and idiosyncratic, as you may have noticed. And Warren and I don't feel like we have any great advantage in the high-tech sector. In fact, we feel like we're at a big disadvantage in trying to understand the nature of technical developments in software, computer chips, or what have you. So we tend to avoid that stuff based on our personal inadequacies. Again, that is a very, very powerful idea. Every person is going to have a circle of competence, and it's going to be very hard to enlarge that circle. If I had to make my living as a musician, I can't even think of a level low enough to describe where I would be sorted out to if music were the measuring standard of the civilization. So you have to figure out what your own aptitudes are. If you play games where other people have the aptitudes and you don't, you're going to lose. And that's as close to certain as any prediction you can make. You have to figure out where you've got an edge, and you've got to play within your own circle of competence. If you want to be the best tennis player in the world, you may start out trying and soon find out that it's hopeless, that other people blow right by you. However, if you want to become the best plumbing contractor in Bemidji, that is probably doable by 2/3 of you. It takes a will, it takes the intelligence. But after a while, you gradually know all about the plumbing business in Bemidji and master the art. That is an attainable objective, given enough discipline, and people who could never win a chess tournament or stand in center court in a respectable tennis tournament can rise quite high in life by slowly developing a circle of competence, which results partly from what they were born with and partly from what they slowly develop through work. So some edges can be acquired, and the game of life, to some extent, for most of us, is trying to be something like a good plumbing contractor in Bemidji. Very few of us are chosen to win the world's chess tournaments. Some of you may find opportunities surfing along in the new high-tech fields, the Intels, the Microsofts, and so on. The fact that we don't think we're very good at it and have pretty well stayed out of it doesn't mean that it's irrational for you to do it. Well, so much for the basic microeconomic models, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of mathematics, helping create what I call the general substructure of worldly wisdom. Now, if you want to go on from carrots to dessert, I'll turn to stock picking, trying to draw on this general worldly wisdom as we go. I don't want to get into emerging markets, bond arbitrage, and so forth. I'm talking about nothing but plain vanilla stock picking. That, believe me, is complicated enough, and I'm talking about common stock picking. The first question is, what is the nature of the stock market? And that gets you directly to this efficient market theory that got to be the rage, a total rage, long after I graduated from law school. And it's rather interesting because one of the greatest economists of the world is a substantial shareholder in Berkshire Hathaway, and has been from the very early days after Buffett was in control. His textbook always taught that the stock market was perfectly efficient, and that nobody could beat it. But his own money went into Berkshire and made him wealthy. So, like Pascal in his famous wager, he hedged his bet. Is the stock market so efficient that people can't beat it? Well, the efficient market theory is obviously roughly right, meaning that markets are quite efficient, and it's quite hard for anybody to beat the market by significant margins as a stock picker by just being intelligent and working in a disciplined way. Indeed, the average result has to be the average result. By definition, everybody can't beat the market. As I always say, the iron rule of life is that only 20% of the people can be in the top fifth. That's just the way it is. So the answer is that it's partly efficient and partly inefficient. And by the way, I have a name for people who went to the extreme efficient market theory, which is bonkers. It was an intellectually consistent theory that enabled them to do pretty mathematics, so I understand its seductiveness to people with large mathematical gifts. It just had a difficulty in that the fundamental assumption did not tie properly to reality. Again, to the man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If you're good at manipulating higher mathematics in a consistent way, why not make an assumption that enables you to use your tool? The model I like, to sort of simplify the notion of what goes on in the market for common stocks, is the parimutuel system at the racetrack. If you stop to think about it, a parimutuel system is a market. Everybody goes there and bets, and the odds change based on what's bet. That's what happens in the stock market. Any damn fool can see that a horse carrying a light weight with a wonderful win rate and a good post position, etc., is way more likely to win than a horse with a terrible record and extra weight and so on and so on. But if you look at the damn odds, the bad horse pays 100 to 1, whereas the good horse pays 3 to 2. Then it's not clear which is statistically the best bet using the mathematics of Fermat and Pascal. The prices have changed in such a way that it's very hard to beat the system, and then the track is taking 17% off the top. So not only do you have to outwit all the other bettors, but you've got to outwit them by such a big margin that on average you can afford to take 17% of your gross bets off the top and give it to the house before the rest of your money can be put to work. Given those mathematics, is it possible to beat the horses using only one's intelligence? Intelligence should give some edge, because lots of people who don't know anything go out and bet lucky numbers and so forth. Therefore, somebody who really thinks about nothing but horse performance and is shrewd and mathematical could have a very considerable edge in the absence of the frictional cost caused by the house take. Unfortunately, what a shrewd horse player's edge does in most cases is to reduce his average loss over a season of betting from the 17% that he would lose if he got the average result to maybe 10%. However, there are actually a few people who can beat the game after paying the full 17%. I used to play poker when I was young with a guy who made a substantial living doing nothing but betting on harness races. Now, harness racing is a relatively inefficient market. You don't have the depth of intelligence betting on harness races that you do on regular races. What my poker pal would do was to think about harness races as his main profession, and he would bet only occasionally when he saw some mispriced bet available, and by doing that, after paying the full handle to the house, which I presume was around 17%, he made a substantial living. You have to say that's rare. However, the market was not perfectly efficient, and if it weren't for that big 17% handle, lots of people would regularly be beating lots of other people at the horse races. It's efficient, yes, but it's not perfectly efficient. And with enough shrewdness and fanaticism, some people will get better results than others. The stock market is the same way, except that the house handle is so much lower. If you take transaction costs, the spread between the bid and the ask plus the commissions, and if you don't trade too actively, you're talking about fairly low transaction costs. So with enough fanaticism and enough discipline, some of the shrewd people are going to get way better results than average in the nature of things. It is not a bit easy, and of course 50% will end up in the bottom half, and 70% will end up in the bottom 70%. But some people will have an advantage, and in a fairly low transaction cost operation, they will get better than average results in stock picking. How do you get to be one of those who is a winner, in a relative sense, instead of a loser? Here again, look at the parimutuel system. I had dinner last night by absolute accident with the president of Santa Anita. He says that there are 2 or 3 bettors who have a credit arrangement with the track now that they have off-track betting, who are actually beating the house. The track is sending money out net after the full handle, a lot of it to Las Vegas, by the way, to people who are actually winning slightly net after paying the full handle. They're that shrewd about something with as much unpredictability as horse racing. It's not given to human beings to have such talent that they can just know everything about everything all the time. But it is given to human beings who work hard at it, who look and sift the world for a mispriced bet, that they can occasionally find one. And the wise ones bet heavily when the world offers them that opportunity. They bet big when they have the odds, and the rest of the time they don't. It's just that simple. That is a very simple concept, and to me it's obviously right, based on experience not only from the parimutuel system, but everywhere else. And yet in investment management, practically nobody operates that way. We operate that way. I'm talking about Buffett and Munger. And we're not alone in the world, but a huge majority of people have some other crazy construct in their heads. And instead of waiting for a near cinch and loading up, they apparently ascribe to the theory that if they work a little harder or hire more business school students, they'll come to know everything about everything all the time. To me, that's totally insane. How many insights do you need? Well, I'd argue that you don't need many in a lifetime. If you look at Berkshire Hathaway and all of its accumulated billions, the top 10 insights account for most of it. And that's with a very brilliant man, Warren's a lot more able than I am and very disciplined, devoting his lifetime to it. I don't mean to say that he's only had 10 insights. I'm just saying that most of the money came from 10 insights. So you can get very remarkable investment results if you think more like a winning parimutuel player. Just think of it as a heavy odds-against game full of bullshit and craziness, with an occasional mispriced something or other. And you're probably not going to be smart enough to find thousands in a lifetime. And when you get a few, you really load up. It's just that simple. When Warren lectures at business schools, he says, I could improve your ultimate financial welfare by giving you a ticket with only 20 slots in it, so that you had 20 punches, representing all the investments that you got to make in a lifetime. And once you'd punched through the card, you couldn't make any more investments at all. He says, under those rules, you'd really think carefully about what you did, and you'd be forced to load up on what you'd really thought about, so you'd do so much better. Again, this is a concept that seems perfectly obvious to me, and to Warren it seems perfectly obvious, but this is one of the very few business classes in the United States where anybody will be saying so. It just isn't the conventional wisdom. To me, it's obvious that the winner has to bet very selectively. It's been obvious to me since very early in life. I don't know why it's not obvious to very many other people. I think the reason why we got into such idiocy in investment management is best illustrated by a story that I tell about the guy who sold fishing tackle. I asked him, my God, they're purple and green. Do fish really take these lures? And he said, Mister, I don't sell to fish. Investment managers are in the position of that fishing tackle salesman. They're like the guy who was selling salt to the guy who already had too much salt. And as long as the guy will buy salt, why, they'll sell salt. But that isn't what ordinarily works for the buyer of investment advice. If you invested Berkshire Hathaway style, it would be hard to get paid as an investment manager as well as they're currently paid, because you'd be holding a block of Walmart and a block of Coca-Cola and a block of something else. You'd be sitting on your ass. And the client would be getting rich. And after a while, the client would think, why am I paying this guy 0.5% a year on my wonderful passive holdings? So what makes sense for the investor is different from what makes sense for the manager. And as usual in human affairs, what determines the behavior are incentives for the decision maker, and getting the incentives right is a very, very important lesson. From all businesses, my favorite case on incentives is Federal Express. The heart and soul of its system, which creates the integrity of the product, is having all its airplanes come to one place in the middle of the night and shift all the packages from plane to plane. If there are delays, the whole operation can't deliver a product full of integrity to Federal Express customers. And it was always screwed up. They could never get it done on time. They tried everything, moral suasion, threats, you name it. And nothing worked. Finally, somebody got the idea to pay all these people not so much an hour, but so much a shift, and when it's all done, they can all go home. Well, their problems cleared up overnight. So getting the incentives right is a very, very important lesson. It was not obvious to Federal Express what the solution was, but maybe now it will hereafter more often be obvious to you. All right, we've now recognized that the market is efficient as a parimutuel system is efficient, with the favorite more likely than the long shot to do well in racing, but not necessarily give any betting advantage to those who bet on the favorite. In the stock market, some railroad that's beset by better competitors and tough unions may be available at 1/3 of its book value. In contrast, IBM in its heyday might be selling at 6 times book value. So it's just like the pari-mutuel system. Any damn fool could plainly see that IBM had better business prospects than the railroad, but once you put the price into the formula, it wasn't so clear anymore what was going to work best for a buyer choosing between the stocks. So it's a lot like a pari-mutuel system, and therefore it gets very hard to beat. What style should the investor use as a picker of common stocks in order to try to beat the market? In other words, to get an above-average long-term result. The standard technique that appeals to a lot of people is called sector rotation. You simply figure out when oils are going to outperform retailers, etc., etc., etc. You just kind of flit around, being in the hot sector of the market, making better choices than other people. And presumably, over a long period of time, you get ahead. However, I know of no really rich sector rotator. Maybe some people can do it. I'm not saying they can't. All I know is that all the people I know who got rich, and I know a lot of them, did not do it that way. The second basic approach is the one that Ben Graham used, much admired by Warren and me. As one factor, Graham had this concept of value to a private owner, what the whole enterprise would sell for if it were available. And that was calculable in many cases. Then, if you could take the stock price and multiply it by the number of shares and get something that was 1/3 or less of sellout value, he would say that you've got a lot of edge going for you. Even with an elderly alcoholic running a stodgy business, this significant excess of real value per share working for you means that all kinds of good things can happen to you. You had a huge margin of safety, as he put it, by having this big excess value going for you. But he was, by and large, operating when the world was in shell shock from the 1930s, which was the worst contraction in the English-speaking world in about 600 years. Wheat in Liverpool, I believe, got down to something like a 600-year low, adjusted for inflation. People were so shell-shocked for a long time thereafter that Ben Graham could run his Geiger counter over this detritus from the collapse of the 1930s and find things selling below their working capital per share, and so on. And in those days, working capital actually belonged to the shareholders. If the employees were no longer useful, you just sacked them all, took the working capital, and stuck it in the owner's pockets. That was the way capitalism then worked. Nowadays, of course, the accounting is not realistic, because the minute the business starts contracting, significant assets are not there. Under social norms and the new legal rules of the civilization, so much is owed to the employees that the minute the enterprise goes into reverse, some of the assets on the balance sheet aren't there anymore. Now, that might not be true if you run a little auto dealership yourself. You may be able to run it in a way that there's no health plan and this and that, so that if the business gets lousy, you can take your working capital and go home. But IBM can't, or at least didn't. Just look at what disappeared from its balance sheet when it decided that it had to change size, both because the world had changed technologically and because its market position had deteriorated. And in terms of blowing it, IBM is some example. Those were brilliant, disciplined people. But there was enough turmoil and technological change that IBM got bounced off the wave after surfing successfully for 60 years. And that was some collapse, an object lesson in the difficulties of technology, and one of the reasons why Buffett and Munger don't like technology very much. We don't think we're any good at it, and strange things can happen. At any rate, the trouble with what I call the classic Ben Graham concept is that gradually the world wised up, and those real obvious bargains disappeared. You could run your Geiger counter over the rubble, and it wouldn't click. But such is the nature of people who have a hammer, to whom, as I mentioned, every problem looks like a nail, that the Ben Graham followers responded by changing the calibration on their Geiger counters. In effect, they started defining a bargain in a different way, and they kept changing the definition so that they could keep doing what they'd always done. And it still worked pretty well. So the Ben Graham intellectual system was a very good one. Of course, the best part of it all was his concept of Mr. Market. Instead of thinking the market was efficient, Graham treated it as a manic depressive who comes by every day. And some days Mr. Market says, "I'll sell you some of my interest for way less than you think it's worth." And other days he comes by and says, "I'll buy your interest at a price that's way higher than you think it's worth." And you get the option of deciding whether you want to buy more, sell part of what you already have, or do nothing at all. To Graham, it was a blessing to be in business with a manic depressive who gave you this series of options all the time. That was a very significant mental construct. And it's been very useful to Buffett, for instance, over his whole adult lifetime. However, if we'd stayed with classic Graham the way Ben Graham did it, we would never have had the record we have. And that's because Graham wasn't trying to do what we did. For example, Graham didn't want to ever talk to management. And his reason was that, like the best sort of professor aiming his teaching at a mass audience, he was trying to invent a system that anybody could use. And he didn't feel that the man in the street could run around and talk to management and learn things. He also had a concept that management would often couch the information very shrewdly to mislead. Therefore, it was very difficult, and that is still true, of course, human nature being what it is. And so, having started out as Grahamites, which by the way worked fine, we gradually got what I would call better insights. And we realized that some company that was selling at 2 or 3 times book value could still be a hell of a bargain because of momentums implicit in its position, sometimes combined with an unusual managerial skill plainly present in some individual or other or some system or other. And once we'd gotten over the hurdle of recognizing that a thing could be a bargain based on quantitative measures that would have horrified Graham, we started thinking about better businesses. And by the way, the bulk of the billions in Berkshire Hathaway have come from the better businesses. Much of the first $200 or $300 million came from scrambling around with our Geiger counters. But the great bulk of the money has come from the great businesses. And even some of the early money was made by being temporarily present in great businesses. Buffett Partnership, for example, owned American Express and Disney when they got pounded down. Most investment managers are in a game where the clients expect them to know a lot about a lot of things. We don't have any clients who could fire us at Berkshire Hathaway, so we don't have to be governed by any such construct. And we came to this notion of finding a mispriced bet and loading up when we were very confident that we were right. So we're way less diversified, and I think our system is miles better. However, in all fairness, I don't think a lot of money managers could successfully sell their services if they used our system. But if you're investing for 40 years in some pension fund, what difference does it make if the path from start to finish is a little more bumpy or a little different than everybody else's, so long as it's all going to work out well in the end? So what if there's a little extra volatility? In investment management today, everybody wants not only to win, but to have the path never diverge very much from a standard path, except on the upside. Well, that is a very artificial, crazy construct. That is really hobbling yourself. Now, investment managers would say, we have to be that way. That's how we're measured. And they may be right in terms of the way the business is now constructed, but from the viewpoint of a rational consumer, the whole system's bonkers and draws a lot of talented people into socially useless activity. And the Berkshire system is not bonkers. It's so damned elementary that even bright people are going to have limited, really valuable insights in a very competitive world when they're fighting against other very bright, hardworking people. And it makes sense to load up on the very few good insights you have instead of pretending to know everything about everything at all times. You're much more likely to do well if you start out to do something feasible instead of something that isn't feasible. Isn't that perfectly obvious? How many of you have 56 brilliant insights in which you have equal confidence? Raise your hands, please. How many of you have 2 or 3 insights that you have some confidence in? I rest my case. We've really made the money out of high-quality businesses. In some cases, we bought the whole business, and in some cases, we just bought a big block of stock. But when you analyze what happened, the big money's been made in the high-quality businesses, and most of the other people who've made a lot of money have done so in high-quality businesses. I'd say that Berkshire Hathaway's system is adapting to the nature of the investment problem as it really is. Over the long term, it's hard for a stock to earn a much better return than the business that underlies it earns. If the business earns 6% on capital over 40 years and you hold it for that 40 years, you're not going to make much different than a 6% return, even if you originally buy it at a huge discount. Conversely, if a business earns 18% on capital over 20 or 30 years, even if you pay an expensive-looking price, you'll end up with one hell of a result. So the trick is getting into better businesses, and that involves all of these advantages of scale that you could consider momentum effects. How do you get into these great companies? One method is what I'd call the method of finding them small. Get them when they're little. For example, buy Walmart when Sam Walton first goes public, and so forth. A lot of people try to do just that, and it's a very beguiling idea. If I were a young man, I might actually go into it. That doesn't work for Berkshire Hathaway anymore because we've got too much money. We can't find anything that fits our size parameter that way. Besides, we're set in our ways. But I regard finding them small as a perfectly intelligent approach for somebody to try with discipline. It's just not something that I've done. Finding them big, obviously, is very hard because of the competition. So far, Berkshire's managed to do it. But can we continue to do it? What's the next Coca-Cola investment for us? Well, the answer to that is I don't know. I think it gets harder for us all the time. And ideally, and we've done this a lot, you get into a great business that also has a great manager because management matters. For example, it's made a hell of a difference to General Electric that Jack Welch came in instead of the guy who took over Westinghouse. One hell of a difference. So management matters too. And some of it is predictable. I do not think it takes a genius to understand that Jack Welch was a more insightful person and a better manager than his peers in other companies. Nor do I think it took tremendous genius to understand that Disney had basic momentums in place that are very powerful, and that Michael Eisner and Frank Wells were very unusual managers. So you do get an occasional opportunity to get into a wonderful business that's being run by a wonderful manager. And of course, that's hog heaven day. If you don't load up when you get those opportunities, it's a big mistake. Occasionally, you'll find a human being who's so talented that he can do things that ordinary skilled mortals can't. I would argue that Simon Marx, who was second generation in Marks and Spencer of England, was such a man. Patterson was such a man at National Cash Register. And Sam Walton was such a man. These people do come along, and in many cases, they're not all that hard to identify. If they've got a reasonable hand, with the fanaticism and intelligence and so on that these people generally bring to the party, then management can matter very much. However, averaged out, betting on the quality of a business is better than betting on the quality of management. In other words, if you have to choose one, bet on the business momentum, not the brilliance of the manager. But very rarely you find a manager who's so good that you're wise to follow him into what looks like a mediocre business. Another very simple effect I very seldom see discussed either by investment managers or anybody else is the effect of taxes. If you're going to buy something that compounds for 30 years at 15% per annum and you pay 135% tax at the very end, the way that works out is that after taxes, you keep 13.3% per annum. In contrast, if you bought the same investment but had to pay taxes every year of 35% out of the 15% that you earned, then your return would be 15% minus 35% of 15%, or only 9.75% per year compounded. So the difference there is over 3.5%. And what 3.5% does to the numbers over long holding periods like 30 years is truly eye-opening. If you sit on your ass for long stretches in great companies, you can get a huge edge from nothing but the way income taxes work. Even with a 10% per annum investment, paying a 35% tax at the end gives you 8.3% after taxes as an annual compounded result after 30 years. In contrast, if you pay the 35% each year instead of at the end, your annual result goes down to 6.5%. So you add nearly 2% of after-tax return per annum if you only achieve an average return by historical standards from common stock investments in companies with low dividend payout ratios. But in terms of business mistakes that I've seen over a long lifetime, I would say that trying to minimize taxes too much is one of the great standard causes of really dumb mistakes. I see terrible mistakes from people being overly motivated by tax considerations. Warren and I personally don't drill oil wells, we pay our taxes, and we've done pretty well so far. Anytime somebody offers you a tax shelter from here on in life, my advice would be don't buy it. In fact, anytime anybody offers you anything with a big commission and a 200-page prospectus, don't buy it. Occasionally you'll be wrong if you adopt Munger's rule. However, over a lifetime, you'll be a long way ahead, and you will miss a lot of unhappy experiences that might otherwise reduce your love for your fellow man. There are huge advantages for an individual to get into a position where you make a few great investments and just sit on your ass. You're paying less to brokers. you're listening to less nonsense. And if it works, the governmental tax system gives you an extra 1, 2, or 3 percentage points per annum compounded. And you think that most of you are going to get that much advantage by hiring investment counselors and paying them 1% to run around incurring a lot of taxes on your behalf? Lots of luck. Are there any dangers in this philosophy? Yes, everything in life has dangers. Since it's so obvious that investing in great companies works, it gets horribly overdone from time to time. In the nifty 50 days, everybody could tell which companies were the great ones. So they got up to 50, 60, and 70 times earnings. And just as IBM fell off the wave, other companies did too. Thus, a large investment disaster resulted from too high prices. And you've got to be aware of that danger, so there are risks. Nothing is automatic and easy. But if you can find some fairly priced, great company and buy it and sit, that tends to work out very, very well indeed, especially for an individual. Within the growth stock model, there's a sub-position. There are actually businesses that you will find a few times in a lifetime where any manager could raise the return enormously just by raising prices, and yet they haven't done it. So they have huge untapped pricing power that they're not using. That is the ultimate no-brainer. That existed in Disney. It's such a unique experience to take your grandchild to Disneyland. You're not doing it that often. And there are lots of people in the country. And Disney found that it could raise those prices a lot and the attendance stayed right up. So a lot of the great record of Eisner and Wells was utter brilliance, but the rest came from just raising prices at Disneyland and Disney World and through video cassette sales of classic animated movies. At Berkshire Hathaway, Warren and I raised the prices of See's candies a little faster than others might have. And of course we invested in Coca-Cola, which had some untapped pricing power. And it also had brilliant management. So Roberto Gosueta and Donald Keogh could do much more than raise prices. It was perfect. You will get a few opportunities to profit from finding underpricing. There are actually people out there who don't price everything as high as the market will easily stand. And once you figure that out, it's like finding money in the street if you have the courage of your convictions. If you look at Berkshire's investments where a lot of the money's been made and you look for the models, you can see that we twice bought into 2 newspaper towns, which have since become 1 newspaper towns. So we made a bet to some extent. In one of those, the Washington Post, we bought it at about 20% of the value to a private owner. So we bought it on a Ben Graham-style basis, at 1/5 of obvious value, and in addition, we faced a situation where you had both the top hand in a game that was clearly going to end up with one winner, and a management with a lot of integrity and intelligence. That one was a real dream. They're very high-class people, the Catherine Graham family. That's why it was a dream, an absolute damn dream. Of course, that came about back in 73, 74. That was almost like 1932. That was probably a once-in-40-years type denouement in the markets. That investment's up about 50 times over our cost. If I were you, I wouldn't count on getting any investment in your lifetime quite as good as the Washington Post was in 73 and 74. Let me mention another model. Of course, Gillette and Coke made fairly low-priced items and have a tremendous marketing advantage all over the world. And in Gillette's case, they keep surfing along new technology, which is fairly simple by the standards of microchips. But it's hard for competitors to do it, so they've been able to stay constantly near the edge of improvements in shaving. There are whole countries where Gillette has more than 90% of the shaving market. Geico is a very interesting model. It's another one of the 100 or so models you ought to have in your head. I've had many friends in the sick business fix game over a long lifetime, and they practically all use the following formula. I call it the cancer surgery formula. They look at this mess and they figure out if there's anything sound left that can live on its own if they cut away everything else. And if they find anything sound, they just cut away everything else. Of course, if that doesn't work, they liquidate the business, but it frequently does work. And Geico had a perfectly magnificent business, submerged in a mess but still working. Misled by success, Geico had done some foolish things. They got to thinking that because they were making a lot of money, they knew everything. And they suffered huge losses. All they had to do was cut out all the folly and go back to the perfectly wonderful business that was lying there. And when you think about it, that's a very simple model. And it's repeated over and over again. And in Geico's case, think about all the money we passively made. It was a wonderful business combined with a bunch of foolishness that could easily be cut out. And people were coming in who were temperamentally and intellectually designed, so they were going to cut it out. That is a model you want to look for. And you may find 1 or 2 or 3 in a long lifetime that are very good. And you may find 20 or 30 that are good enough to be quite useful. Finally, I'd like to talk once again about investment management. That is a funny business, because on a net basis, the whole investment management business together gives no value added to all buyers combined. That's the way it has to work. Of course, that isn't true of plumbing, and it isn't true of medicine. If you're going to make your careers in the investment management business, you face a very peculiar situation. And most investment managers handle it with psychological denial, just like a chiropractor. That is the standard method of handling the limitations of the investment management process. But if you want to live the best sort of life, I would urge each of you not to use the psychological denial mode. I think a select few, a small percentage of the investment managers, can deliver value added. But I don't think brilliance alone is enough to do it. I think that you have to have a little of this discipline of calling your shots and loading up if you want to maximize your chances of becoming one who provides above-average real returns for clients over the long pull. But I'm just talking about investment managers engaged in common stock picking. I am agnostic elsewhere. I think there may well be people who are so shrewd about currencies and this, that, and the other thing that they can achieve good long-term records operating on a pretty big scale in that way. But that doesn't happen to be my milieu. I'm talking about stock picking in American stocks. I think it's hard to provide a lot of value added to the investment management client, but it's not impossible. Talk 2 Revisited. As I reviewed Talk 2 in 2006, I thought it would be improved by adding 1. An attempt to explain the extreme investment success of Harvard and Yale in recent years, plus 2. A prediction about the outcomes for the many pools of capital that will now try to duplicate the past success of Harvard and Yale by copying or continuing their methods, plus 3. A brief comment about the implications for the efficient market hypothesis as demonstrated in a 2005 book, Fortune's Formula by William Poundstone. To me, it seems likely that as Harvard and Yale de-emphasized conventional unleveraged holding of diversified U.S. common stocks, their investment success was boosted by factors including the four described below. 1. By investing in LBO, leveraged buyout funds, Harvard and Yale introduced leverage into their results from owning interests in U.S. businesses. And the LBO fund structure gave them a way to make their leveraged business investments in a manner safer than is possible in a normal margin account, prone during panics to forced sales. Decent comparative results often followed in markets with tolerable general outcomes. And this happened even when net after cost results from investments in the LBO funds were no better than would have occurred through only slightly leveraged investment in an index of U.S. stocks. 2. In category after category, Harvard and Yale selected or directly employed investment managers who were way above average in ability, providing additional evidence that investment markets are not perfectly efficient and that some good investment results come from abnormal skill or other abnormal advantage. As one example, Harvard and Yale, by reason of their own prestige, were able to get into some of the most profitable high-tech venture capital funds not available to all other investors. These funds, using momentum provided by their own past success, had an opportunity advantage over less well-established venture capital operations, in that the best entrepreneurs, quite logically, made early presentations to the best-regarded funds. 3. Harvard and Yale wisely and opportunistically imitated investment banking firms by going into several activities that were then non-traditional, like investing in distressed U.S. corporate bonds and high-coupon foreign bonds and leveraged fixed-income arbitrage, during a period when many good opportunities were available to skilled operators in the activities chosen. 4. Finally, the benefits that came to Harvard and Yale in recent years through leverage and unconventionality were often, of course, given a large tailwind by a happy combination of declining interest rates and rising price-earnings ratios for stocks. The extreme investment success of Harvard and Yale gives me both pleasure and pain. My pleasure comes from this demonstration that academic skill is often useful in worldly affairs. People like me who were attracted by academia yet have gone into business naturally respond to such worldly achievement, much like the many modern scientists who relish the example of Thales of Miletus. This scientist of antiquity made a large profit by leasing most of the olive presses in his area just before the occurrence of a particularly bountiful harvest. My pain comes from 1. Foreseeing a lot of future adversity for other worthy institutions, driven by envy and salesmen into enthusiastic imitation of Harvard and Yale, and 2. Disapproval of the conduct of many of the salesmen likely to succeed in pushing the imitation. Something similar to what I fear happened near the end of the high-tech bubble. At that time, envy of successful early-stage high-tech venture capital investors like Stanford, plus the dubious sales methods of many venture capitalists, caused about $90 billion to rush into low-quality, imitative early-stage ventures that by now may have created as much as $45 billion in net losses for late-coming investors. Moreover, Harvard and Yale may now need new displays of unconventional wisdom that are different from their last displays. It is quite counterintuitive to decrease that part of one's activity that has recently worked best, but this is often a good idea. And so also with reducing one's perception of one's needs, instead of increasing risks in an attempt to satisfy perceived needs. Talk 2 was made in 1994, about 12 years before this addendum was written. And during that 12 years, much useful thought and data collection has supported the idea that neither securities markets nor pari-mutuel betting systems at racetracks prevent some venturers from gaining highly satisfactory, way above average results through unusual skill. William Poundstone's book, Fortune's Formula, collects much of the modern evidence on this point in a highly entertaining way. Moreover, the book contains an account of the Lollapalooza investment record of Claude Shannon, pioneer scientist in information theory, that makes Shannon's methods look much like those of Charlie Munger. Worldly Wisdom Updated. Q&A with Charlie. How do you and Warren evaluate an acquisition candidate? We're light on financial yardsticks. We apply lots of subjective criteria. Can we trust management? Can it harm our reputation? What can go wrong? Do we understand the business? Does it require capital infusions to keep it going? What is the expected cash flow? We don't expect linear growth. Cyclicality is fine with us as long as the price is appropriate. What should a young person look for in a career? I have 3 basic rules. Meeting all 3 is nearly impossible, but you should try anyway. Don't sell anything you wouldn't buy yourself. Don't work for anyone you don't respect and admire. Work only with people you enjoy. I have been incredibly fortunate in my life. With Warren, I had all 3. What overall life advice do you have for young people? Spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up. Discharge your duties faithfully and well. Step by step you get ahead, but not necessarily in fast spurts. But you build discipline by preparing for fast spurts. Slug it out 1 inch at a time, day by day, and at the end of the day, if you live long enough, like most people, you will get out of life what you deserve. Life in its various passages can be hard, brutally hard. The 3 things I have found helpful in coping with its challenges are: have low expectations, have a sense of humor, surround yourself with the love of friends and family. Above all, live with change and adapt to it. If the world didn't change, I'd still have a 12 handicap. Talk 3. A lesson on elementary worldly wisdom as it relates to investment management and business, revisited. April 19th, 1996, Stanford Law School. This talk was given in 1996 to the students of Professor William C. Lazier, who was the Nancy and Charles Munger Professor of Business at Stanford University Law School. Because this talk, published in Outstanding Investor Digest on December 29, 1997, and March 13, 1998, repeats many of the ideas and much of the language included in other talks, particularly practical thought about practical thought, your editor has abridged certain passages and added comments to maintain the logic and flow of the speech. Even with the abridgments, this talk includes many unique ideas, as well as familiar ones expressed in novel ways. What I'm going to try to do today is to extend the remarks I made 2 years ago at the USC Business School. You were assigned a transcript of my USC talk. There's nothing I said then that I wouldn't repeat today, but I want to amplify what I said then. It's perfectly clear that if Warren Buffett had never learned anything new after graduating from the Columbia Business School, Berkshire would be a pale shadow of its present self. Warren would have gotten rich because what he learned from Ben Graham at Columbia was enough to make anybody rich, but he wouldn't have the kind of enterprise Berkshire Hathaway is if he hadn't kept learning. How do you get worldly wisdom? What system do you use to rise into the tiny top percentage of the world in terms of having sort of an elementary, practical wisdom? I've long believed that a certain system, which almost any intelligent person can learn, works way better than the systems that most people use. As I said at the USC Business School, what you need is a latticework of mental models in your head. And you hang your actual experience and your vicarious experience that you get from reading and so forth on this latticework of powerful models. And with that system, things gradually get to fit together in a way that enhances cognition. Charlie discusses several of the specific mental models elaborated in other talks. Your assigned reading for today included the latest annual letters from Jack Welch and Warren Buffett relating to General Electric and Berkshire Hathaway, respectively. Jack Welch has a PhD in engineering, and Warren plainly could have gotten a PhD in any field he wanted to pursue.